The Neolithic Revolution, the bargain that made us. Chapter 1, The Seed and the Silence. I want you to begin by holding a single seed in your mind. Not a temple, not a king, not a golden mask in a museum case. Just one grass seed, small and dry, no bigger than a grain of rice, resting in the palm of a human hand 11,000 years ago. That seed is where I want to start, because that seed is where you start. And I mean you, personally, the person listening to my voice right now, wherever you are, whatever you are doing. If you ate today, you ate the descendants of a decision that a few people made, without knowing they were making it, on a warm plain in the Middle East before anyone had invented the word for a year. If you live in a town, if you have ever paid rent or filled out a tax form or lain awake worrying about the future, you are living inside the long echo of that seed. That is not poetry. That is history, and I am going to spend the next several hours showing you exactly how. Here is the thing that gives me chills every single time, the thing I never quite get over. For hundreds of thousands of years, our species did just fine without that seed. For roughly 300,000 years, human beings, people exactly as clever as you, with exactly the same brains, the same loves, the same fear of the dark, lived by walking. They walked after the herds, they walked to the ripening fruit, they walked to the good fishing and away from the bad weather, and they fed themselves by knowing the land the way you know the rooms of your own house. And then, in a geological blink, a few thousand years, which sounds long until you set it against 300,000, almost all of them stopped walking. They stayed. They put seeds in the ground and waited. And nothing about the human story was ever the same again. We have a name for that change. We call it the Neolithic Revolution, and I have to tell you, both halves of that name are a little bit of a lie, and the lies are interesting, so hold on to them. The word Neolithic just means new stone, the new Stone Age, named for the polished stone tools people were making. And the word revolution was chosen deliberately by a brilliant, tragic Australian archaeologist named Vere Childe, who put it into a book in 1936 because he wanted you to feel that this was as enormous as the Industrial Revolution. He was right that it was enormous. He may have been wrong that it was a revolution because, as we'll see, it took thousands of years, longer than the entire span from ancient Rome to right now. We'll come back to Childe. He's one of the most fascinating and heartbreaking figures in this whole story, and I'm not going to let you leave without meeting him properly. But here is the paradox I want to plant in you today, the one I want you to carry through everything that follows, because it is the deep secret at the center of this episode. We tend to assume that farming was progress, that our ancestors were half-starved, shivering, desperate hunters, and that agriculture rescued them, gave them full bellies and leisure and safety and art. That is the story most of us were taught, and it is, in the most important way, false. Because when you dig up the actual bodies, and we have thousands of them, and I'll show you how they read like a confession, the first farmers were shorter than the foragers who came before them. They were more anemic. Their teeth were rotting in their jaws. Their bones are pitted with the marks of infection and hunger and back-breaking labor. In parts of Europe, the average man lost around 5 inches of height when farming arrived, and it took until the 20th century, with vaccines and refrigerators, for people in some of those places to grow tall again. A scientist named Jared Diamond once wrote an essay with a title so provocative it still starts arguments, and the title was "The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race." He meant farming. He meant this, and I want you to sit with why a serious person could look at the thing that built every city you have ever walked through and call it a catastrophe. So here is the mystery, and it is a real one, a live one that the smartest people who study this still argue about, sometimes bitterly. If farming made individual human beings shorter, sicker, and more miserable, why on earth did we do it? Why did almost every human society on Earth, independently, in places that had never heard of each other, walk into the same trap at roughly the same moment in our history? Why did we plant the seed? I am not going to pretend I can hand you a clean answer, because there isn't one, and I promised you honesty from the first minute, and I intend to keep that promise all the way to the end. What I can do, what I am so excited to do, is take you into the evidence, the actual dirt and bone and charred grain and ancient DNA, and let you feel how we know what we know, and how much we gloriously still don't. That is the journey we are going to take together. And it is a strange journey, because it is a journey into a world with no writing. Nobody at the beginning of this story could write. There are no letters, no chronicles, no names of kings, no love poems, no complaints scratched into clay. For most of the time we're talking about, there is a silence more total than anything you can imagine. Millennia of human lives, births and deaths and marriages and murders and inventions, with not one word left behind. And yet we can read it. We can read a hunter-gatherer's last meal from the pollen in his gut. We can read a village's collapse from the density of pollen in a lake bed. We can read, in the bend of a woman's toe bones, the thousands of hours she knelt at a grinding stone. We are going to become detectives together, and I promise you, it is one of the greatest detective stories there is. There are a handful of images I want to promise you now, so that when we reach them you'll feel the thrill of a promise kept. I am going to take you to a hill in Turkey where hunter-gatherers, people with no farms, no pottery, no metal, somehow hauled 20-ton pillars of stone into circles and carved them with snarling foxes and vultures, thousands of years before Stonehenge, thousands of years before the pyramids. It should not exist. It changes everything. We'll stand inside it. I am going to introduce you to an old man buried 12,000 years ago with his hand resting gently on the body of a puppy. One of the oldest signs we have of the bond between a human and a dog, a bond so familiar it might make your chest ache. I'm going to show you the first houses, the first fences, the first gold hoarded in a single grave while others got nothing. I'm going to show you death pits, and I will not look away from them, because honesty matters more than comfort. And I'm going to bring you back at the very end to your own kitchen, your own body, your own restless, planning, future-haunted mind, and show you the seed in all of it. There is one more image I want you to hold, and then we'll begin properly. Picture a field of wild wheat, ripe gold, rippling in the wind. In a wild field, when the grain is ready, the seed heads shatter at the lightest touch, flinging their seeds to the ground to plant the next generation. That's how the plant survives. But every so often, by pure accident, one stalk carries a mutation that makes it not shatter. It just stands there, holding its seed, stubborn, refusing to let go. In the wild, that stalk is a failure. It can't scatter, it can't reproduce, it's an evolutionary dead end. But the day a human being walks through that field with a sickle and cuts the stalks and carries them home, everything reverses. The shattering stalks drop their seed in the field and are lost. The stubborn one, the one that would not let go, rides home in the bundle, and its seeds are the ones that get planted next spring. Remember that stubborn little stalk. Remember the one that would not let go. Because that, more than any king or god or invention, is the true beginning of the world we live in. Nobody planned it. Nobody chose it. It happened to us as much as we did it, and it is where our story truly begins. Chapter 2. Reading a World Without Words. Before I take you back into the deep past, I have to tell you how we get there at all, because otherwise you'd be right not to trust me. I'm about to make some extraordinarily specific claims about people who left no records, what they ate when they wove their first cloth, whether a particular woman grew up in a different valley from where she died. You would be completely reasonable to stop me and say, "How could you possibly know that? So let me earn your trust. Let me show you the tools, Because honestly, this is one of my favorite parts of the whole story. I find the detective work almost as thrilling as the crimes. Start with a burnt seed. When a seed falls into a cooking fire and chars, something wonderful happens, at least for us. It stops being food. The carbon locks up, the microbes and worms lose interest, and that charred little husk can sit in the ground for 20,000 years, chemically inert, waiting. For most of the history of archaeology, we threw those away. We literally shoveled the evidence into the spoil heap without seeing it. And then in the 1970s, someone popularized a technique so simple it's almost embarrassing. You take the dirt from a dig and you pour it into water. The heavy stuff, stones, sand, sinks. The charred plant remains float. You skim them off the top, dry them, and put them under a microscope. It's called flotation, and I am not exaggerating when I say it rewrote human prehistory. Without it, the entire story of the first farmers, every seed, every weed, every crumb of ancient bread would still be invisible, sitting in a heap somebody dug out and dumped. And here is the single most important thing those floated seeds can tell us. Remember the stubborn stalk from a moment ago, the one that wouldn't let go of its grain. Under a microscope, you can see the difference. Wild wheat and barley have a fragile little joint, the rachis, that snaps clean when the seed is ripe so the plant can scatter. Domesticated wheat has a tough rachis that stays whole because we unknowingly bred it that way by harvesting it. So when an archaeologist finds a layer of grain with fragile, shattering joints, they are looking at wild plants. And when they find, in a higher, later layer at the same site, grain with tough joints, they are watching domestication happen, frozen in the dirt, one stratum on top of the other. At a site on the Euphrates called Abu Hurira, which we'll visit, you can read exactly that. Wild rye at the bottom, domestic forms creeping in above. The transformation of the human diet captured like a photograph. I think that is glorious. Now seeds tell you about plants. For the animals, we read bones. And the trick here is beautiful in its simplicity. When people hunt wild animals, they kill whatever they can, old, young, male, female, in roughly the proportions the wild herd comes in. But the moment people start herding, start managing animals as property, the pattern on the bones changes, and it changes in a way that gives the whole game away. Herders kill the young males because you only need a few males to breed your flock, and you keep the females alive to old age because they give you milk and offspring. So when a zooarchaeologist lays out the bones from a site and sees a sudden glut of young male sheep and a scarcity of old females, they know. They know that somewhere in that layer, hunting turned into herding. Nobody wrote it down. The bones wrote it down. Then there's the clock. None of this would mean anything if we couldn't date it, and the way we date it is one of the genuine miracles of 20th century science. A man named Willard Libby worked out, in the late 1940s, that living things absorb a faint, steady trickle of radioactive carbon from the atmosphere while they're alive, and that the moment they die, that carbon starts to decay at a perfectly known rate, half of it gone every 5,700 years or so. So if you measure how much is left in a scrap of charcoal, or a bone, or a single charred seed, you can count backward and ask, how long since this was alive? Libby tested it on wood from Egyptian tombs whose age was already known from written records, and it worked. It won him the Nobel Prize, and it gave archaeology something it had never had. A real, honest clock reaching tens of thousands of years into the dark. Later, they learned to count the individual carbon atoms directly, so that today a single burnt grain, a thing you could lose in the creases of your palm, is enough to fix a date. But the tool that has turned this whole field upside down in just the last decade or so, the one that genuinely keeps me up at night with excitement, is ancient DNA. It turns out that the densest bone in your body is a little wedge behind your ear, the petrous bone, the one that houses your inner ear. And that dense little bone protects DNA from the ravages of time far better than any other part of the skeleton, sometimes 100 times better. So researchers learn to drill into that bone, extract the genetic ghost inside, and read the genome of a person who died 9,000 years ago. And what that has done, I'll show you again and again, is settle arguments that raged for a century. When farming spread into Europe, was it people moving, carrying their seeds and animals? Or was it just the idea moving, neighbors teaching neighbors, while the population stayed the same? For decades, brilliant people fought over this with nothing but pottery styles to go on. Ancient DNA answered it, and I'll tell you the answer when we get there, and it is not the comfortable one. There is more, and I'll deploy it as we need it, so let me just introduce the rest of the team. There is isotope analysis, which rests on the lovely fact that you truly are what you eat and where you grew up. The chemistry of your food and your local water gets written into your bones and locked into your teeth, so that from a scrap of tooth enamel, we can sometimes tell that a person spent their childhood in a different valley from the one they were buried in. That single fact, as you'll see, cracks open one of the darkest stories in this whole episode. And then there is experimental archaeology, which is simply the wonderful, hands-on business of trying to do it yourself, napping a flint sickle and going out to harvest a real field or felling an oak with a polished stone axe to see how long it takes. At a farm in England, they found that one person with a flint sickle could reap about an acre of wheat in a long day's work, enough grain to feed a family for a year. At a site in Denmark, they took a polished Neolithic axe, the kind we'd assumed was crude, and cut down an oak more than a foot thick in under half an hour. So much for the primitive cavemen. These people were engineers. I want to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of place where a good story can outrun the actual evidence. Every one of these tools has limits, and the good scientists are the first to say so. Radiocarbon dates come with error bars and need careful calibration. DNA degrades, and the early days of the field were littered with false claims. Dinosaur DNA, DNA from insects in amber, all of it later shown to be modern contamination. The skeleton only records the slow diseases, the ones that scar bone. The fast, explosive epidemics that might have wiped out whole villages leave no mark at all, which means our picture of ancient health may be systematically too rosy. I tell you all of this not to undercut what follows, but to arm you so that when I say we know, you'll know exactly how we know, and when I say we think but we're not sure, you'll trust that too. Here is what we're sure of, here is our best guess, and here, gloriously, is what we still do not know. That's the deal. Now let me take you back, all the way back, before the first farm, before the first village, to a world that was already, quietly, extraordinary. Chapter 3, The People Who Stayed, Almost. Let me take you to the shore of a lake in what is now northern Israel, 23,000 years ago. I want you to picture it, because for most of us the phrase, the Ice Age, conjures mammoths and frozen wastes, and this is nothing like that. This is the Sea of Galilee, warm and blue, fringed with reeds, loud with waterfowl. On the southern shore stands a little cluster of huts, 6 of them oval, made of brushwood, each with a hearth glowing at its heart. This place is called Oholo II, and the only reason we know about it is a small modern tragedy that turned into a scientific miracle. In 1989, a drought dropped the level of the lake by several meters, and there, emerging from the mud that had sealed it away for 23,000 years, was a hunter-gatherer camp preserved so perfectly it stops your breath. Inside one of those huts, the floor was covered with over 90,000 seeds from more than 100 species of wild plants. Wild barley, wild wheat, wild oats, grasses of every kind, nuts and fruits. And clustered around a flat basalt grinding stone set into the floor, the seeds fell in a particular pattern, a U-shape, opening away from the stone. Exactly the scatter you'd get if a person sat there, at the open end of the U, grinding grain hour after hour, and letting the husks fall around them. One researcher looked at that pattern and saw a woman squatting at her grindstone. It may be the oldest evidence we have of a specific human being's daily work, and we can almost see her. And here is the detail that I find almost unbearably important, because it detonates the whole idea that farming was some sudden flash of genius. Among those seeds, growing in the disturbed ground around the huts, were weeds, the specific kinds of weeds that thrive only where humans break the soil. Which means these people, 23,000 years ago, 12,000 years before anyone would call it farming, were already, in some small way, working the ground. And on the floor were flint blades with a telltale sheen on their edges, the gloss you only get from cutting the silica-rich stems of cereals. They had sickles. They were harvesting wild grain with sickles, grinding it, maybe planting a little of it, 12,000 years before the invention of agriculture. Do you see what I'm getting at? The line we draw between hunter-gatherer and farmer, so clean in a textbook, is a smudge. It was always a smudge. But I don't want to rush past these people on the way to the farms, because that would be to make exactly the mistake I'm asking you to avoid. These foragers were not a rough draft of us. They were not waiting, half-formed, for agriculture to complete them. They had, by a powerful argument, a better life than the farmers who followed, and I need to slow down and make that case, because it is the emotional bedrock of everything else. In 1966, at a now-famous gathering of anthropologists, a scholar named Marshall Salin stood up and proposed something that scandalized the room. He called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society. Not affluent because they had things, they had almost nothing, because when you walk for a living, you can't carry much. Affluent because their wants were few and easily met. He called it the Zen road to affluence. You can be rich either by having a great deal or by wanting very little, and the foragers took the second road. His evidence came from anthropologists who actually lived with modern hunter-gatherers, like the Kung San of the Kalahari, people who, it turned out, spent only around 15 to 20 hours a week getting food. The rest was rest. Visiting, talking, sleeping, playing, making music. When someone asked one, Kung Man, why his people hadn't taken up farming like their neighbors, he gave an answer I think about constantly. He said, "Why should we, when there are so many mongongo nuts in the world?" Now I have to be careful and honest, because this idea got romanticized, and the honesty is part of the story. Salin's had critics, sharp ones. A scholar named David Kaplan pointed out that when you actually count all the work, not just the hunting and gathering, but the food preparation, the firewood, the water hauling, the childcare, the forager work week climbs to something much closer to our own. And even the man who did the original. Kung Fieldwork later agreed that, all in, they worked something like 40 hours a week. Foraging life had real hardship, high infant mortality, no medicine, seasons of genuine hunger, and as we'll see, plenty of violence. So I'm not selling you a paradise. There was no Eden. And this is the part that survives every attack the core insight holds. Compared to the farmers who came after them, these foragers ate a wider, richer variety of food. They were taller and healthier, and they were nobody's subjects. And their diet was their insurance. The Kung drew on well over 100 different edible plants across the seasons. When one failed, another was there. Compare that to an Irish peasant family in the 1840s, dependent on a single kind of potato, starving to death by the hundreds of thousands when that one crop failed. A forager could not starve the way a farmer could starve. That is not a small thing. That is, in a way, the whole thing. So this is the world on the eve of the change. Mobile, various, deeply knowledgeable, materially poor and nutritionally rich, spread thin across a generous land. A world that had lasted in its essential shape for a scarcely imaginable stretch of time. And into it, in one particular corner of the Middle East, stepped a people who would do something almost no forager had ever done. They would stop. They would build houses of stone and stay in them all year round for generations. They would bury their dead beneath their feet and keep them close. They are called the Natufians, and they are the hinge of our entire story, the last great foragers, and the doorway to everything that comes after. I have wanted to tell you about them since we began. Let's go meet them. Chapter 4: The First People Who Stayed. The Natufians get their name from a dry valley, a wadi, in the hills near Jerusalem, where in 1928 a remarkable British archaeologist named Dorothy Garrod first dug up traces of them. And I want to pause on Dorothy Garrod for just a second, because she is exactly the kind of person this story is full of, and popular history tends to forget. A woman who, in a field ferociously dominated by men, would go on to become the first female professor at Cambridge University in any subject at all. She named a whole culture, and she named it well: the Natufians. They lived in the Levant, modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, from roughly 15,000 to about 11,500 years ago. And they arrived at a lucky moment. The world had been warming out of the Ice Age, and their homeland had turned into a kind of Mediterranean parkland, thick with wild cereals, oak and pistachio and almond, gazelle grazing in the open, birds clouding the marshes. It was, as one archaeologist described a place like it, a hunter's dream. And in this abundance, the Natufians did the revolutionary, world-altering, almost unthinkable thing. They stopped walking. At a site called Ain Malaha, up in the Jordan Valley, they built round houses, semi-sunk into the ground, walled with stone, with hearths and storage pits. Real houses built to last, lived in year-round. This is sedentism, permanent settlement, and it is arguably a bigger leap than farming itself, because everything that farming would later require, staying put, storing food, owning a place, packing human beings close together, the Natufians did first, while still living entirely off the wild. They were hunter-gatherers who had a hometown. And oh, the things we find in that hometown. Let me just tell you about the food, because it will not be what you expect. At a Natufian site in Jordan called Shoebaker, archaeologists found the charred crumbs of bread, actual bread, a flatbread ground from wild cereals and the tubers of a marsh plant, baked on a hot stone 14,400 years ago. That is more than 4,000 years before farming. Let that sit with you. Bread came before farming. We baked before we sowed. And at a cave on Mount Carmel called Rakefit, in the residue left in stone mortars, researchers found the chemical traces of the oldest alcohol we know of, beer, or something like it, brewed perhaps 13,000 years ago from stored wild grain. Bread and beer, the twin comforts of settled humanity, both older than the first field. I find that not just charming but profound, and we'll come back to that idea, because some serious scholars think it was the desire to feast, to gather and eat and drink together, that pulled us toward farming in the first place. Hold that thought. But it's the burials that break my heart in the best way, and I have to slow down for them. At Ain Malaha, around 12,000 years ago, someone buried an elderly human being, and curled against them, deliberately placed, was a puppy, 4 or 5 months old. In some accounts, the dead person's hand rests on the animal. I told you at the very beginning I would bring you here, and here we are. This is one of the oldest signs we have anywhere on Earth of the bond between a person and a dog. Not a working animal, not a tool, but a companion, buried with someone who apparently could not bear to be parted from it, even in death. When we get to the story of how animals came into our lives, I'll show you that the dog came first, long before the sheep or the goat, and came not as livestock, but as a friend by the fire. But I wanted you to feel it here in this grave first. 12,000 years, and that tenderness reaches across all of it and arrives intact in your chest. There is a stranger, willed a burial too, and I can't resist it. At a place called Hilazantaktit in a cave, archaeologists found the grave of a small, disabled woman, buried around 12,000 years ago with astonishing care and even more astonishing company. The remains of at least 3 wild cattle, 86 tortoise shells arranged around her body like a skirt, the wingtip of a golden eagle, the pelvis of a leopard, the skull of a stone marten. This was a funeral feast and a funeral costume laid down for someone who mattered enormously. Many people call her a shaman, and I want to be honest that shaman is our word, our guess, a label we press onto a mystery. But something about this woman terrified or awed or comforted her community so deeply that they buried 86 tortoises with her. We will never know her name or her gift. We know she was not ordinary. Sometimes that is all the past will give you, and you have to let it be enough, and honestly, the not knowing is part of what makes it holy. So the Natufians were flourishing, settled, fed, artful, spiritual, trading for shells from the Nile and obsidian from Anatolia across hundreds of miles. And then the sky turned on them. Around 12,900 years ago, the climate convulsed. A period we call the Younger Dryas, named, of all things, for a little Arctic wildflower whose pollen suddenly reappears in the sediment cores of Europe, slammed the warming world back into the cold. In Greenland, temperatures plunged, in places by up to 10 degrees, and the shift may have taken as little as a few years. The Levant grew cold and dry. The rich parkland that had fed the Natufians began to fail, the wild cereal stands thinned, the gazelle herds faltered. And a people who had built their whole way of life on staying put, on a landscape that would provide, suddenly found the landscape breaking its promise. Now here is where the great debate begins, and I'm only going to open the door to it because the next chapter is going to walk all the way through. Some of these squeezed, desperate, formerly comfortable villagers, faced with a shrinking wild harvest, appear to have done something new. They started to help the grain along, to clear the ground for it, to save the best seed and put it back in the earth on purpose. Not because they had a vision of farms and cities, but because they were hungry and they were sedentary, and they had run out of the option their ancestors always had, the option to simply walk away to somewhere better. Or maybe that's not why at all. Maybe the cold snap had nothing to do with it. Maybe it was religion or feasting or population or something in the human mind we can barely name. Because the honest truth, and I promised you honesty, is that the single biggest question in this entire story, the question of why we did it, is one that the brightest minds who have ever studied it cannot agree on. They have been arguing about it for 100 years. They are arguing about it right now. And that argument, believe it or not, is one of the most gripping, intellectual detective stories I know. So let me introduce you to the suspects. Chapter 5. The Question with No Answer. I want to frame this whole chapter as a courtroom because that's honestly how it feels when you read the literature. There is a body, the old forager way of life, dead. There is a mystery, who or what killed it and why. And there is a parade of brilliant, stubborn, often gloriously opinionated detectives, each convinced they've cracked it, each pointing at a different culprit. Let me bring them on one by one, because their disagreement is not a weakness in our knowledge. It is the most honest thing about it. The first is the man I promised you we'd meet properly, Vere Childe, who gave the Neolithic revolution its name. And I have to tell you about him, because his life is one of the most instructive and heartbreaking stories in the whole history of this field. Childe was a slight, awkward, bespectacled man, sickly as a boy, bullied for being unathletic, socially uncomfortable his whole life. He was also a committed Marxist, which shaped how he saw everything. He believed history was driven by changes in technology and economics, by revolutions in how humans make their living. And he became, without much argument, the most influential archaeologist of the 20th century, the man who synthesized the whole sweep of European prehistory into a story. His explanation for why farming began was called the oasis theory. The idea, which he borrowed from an American geologist, was that as the Ice Age ended, the Near East dried out. People, plants, and animals were all driven together around shrinking water holes, crowded into forced intimacy, and in that intimacy we learned to tame the creatures and plant the seeds huddled beside us. It's a beautiful, cinematic idea. And it is almost certainly wrong, because when we finally got good climate data, it turned out the region was getting wetter, not drier, exactly when farming began. I find something moving in that. The most famous theory by the most famous name, undone by the evidence. And Childe himself, in 1957, old and feeling that the world had passed him by, walked to the edge of a cliff in the Blue Mountains of Australia and stepped off. He left instructions, quietly, that his best work was behind him. He was wrong about the oasis, but he was right that this was a revolution, and he gave us the words we're still using. I think he deserves to be remembered with tenderness. Against Childe stepped a very different man. Robert Braidwood, an American, an architect turned archaeologist, a veteran of wartime weather mapping. Braidwood looked at the oasis theory and essentially said, "That's a story, let's go dig." And in the 1940s and 50s, he ran one of the first truly interdisciplinary excavations in history, hauling botanists and geologists and zoologists out to the foothills of Iraq, to a site called Jarmo. His counter-idea was called the hilly flanks hypothesis, and it was simple and it turned out correct. Farming didn't begin down in the parched valleys, it began up in the well-watered foothills, the hilly flanks of the mountains curving around the fertile Crescent, because that is exactly where the wild ancestors of wheat and barley and sheep and goats actually lived. The climate wasn't the trigger, Braidwood argued. The plants were already there, the animals were already there. What changed was the people, a kind of cultural readiness, a settling in. It's a quieter theory than Childe's, less dramatic, and the dirt has largely proven Braidwood right about the geography. There's a small, human detail I can't leave out. Braidwood and his wife Linda, his partner in every excavation for over half a century, died on the very same day in 2003. I don't know why that moves me as much as it does, but it does. Then the theories multiply, and this is where it gets wonderfully contentious. A chain-smoking, combative American named Louis Binford argued it was population pressure, that growing populations in the best coastal spots pushed daughter groups out into marginal land where they had no choice but to intensify, to squeeze more food from less. His student Kent Flannery refined it into something called the broad-spectrum revolution, the idea that as easy big game got scarce, people were forced to broaden their diet, eating the snails and small seeds and fiddly little foods they'd ignored before, and that this broadening set the stage for cultivation. These are push theories. Something forced us. Hunger, crowding, crisis. But there is a whole other camp, and I have to say I find them the most interesting because they argue the opposite, that nobody pushed us at all, that we were pulled. In 1978, a scholar named Barbara Bender made a radical suggestion, that farming wasn't about hunger at all, it was about ambition. That in societies where some people wanted to rise above others, to build alliances and throw feasts and show off, they needed surplus, more food than they strictly required, and agriculture was the way to manufacture it. A Canadian archaeologist named Brian Hayden pushed this into what he called the competitive feasting model. And I have to confess it's my personal favorite of all the theories, purely because it's so gloriously human. Hayden's picture is this. In a village, ambitious individuals throw ever bigger feasts, each one a display of generosity that is secretly a display of power. My feast is bigger than your feast. And you cannot reliably throw a huge feast on wild food. So you domesticate. You grow the calorie-dense grain and breed the animals so you can brew the beer and roast the meat and outgive your rival. In this telling, agriculture wasn't invented to keep us from starving. It was invented so that somebody could show off. I think that is both hilarious and, knowing human beings, entirely plausible. And then, deepest of all, there is the idea that what changed first was not the climate or the belly or the social ladder, but the mind. A French archaeologist named Jacques Covin argued for a revolution of symbols, that before people domesticated a single plant, something shifted in how they imagined themselves in relation to the world, in their gods and their art, a new sense of humans as separate from and master over nature. And the great British archaeologist Ian Hodder, who spent 25 years excavating one extraordinary Neolithic town, developed the idea that the concept of the house itself, the domus, the tamed inside space set against the wild outside, reorganized the human mind and pulled agriculture along in its wake. Hodder even argued in a later book that we became trapped, that once we entangled ourselves with these needy plants and animals and houses and stores, we couldn't get out. Farming, in his phrase, was less a choice than a trap that snapped shut slowly, over generations, one dependency at a time. So who's right? Here is the honest answer, and I want to be completely straight with you. We do not know, and it is entirely possible that everyone is a little bit right, because it almost certainly happened differently in different places for different reasons. But you can feel the deep fault line running through all of it, and I want you to hold it, because it runs through the rest of this episode and, frankly, through your own life. On one side, we were pushed. Cold, hunger, crowding, crisis, forced into farming with our backs against the wall. On the other, we were pulled. Ambition, ritual, feasting, the restless human hunger to build and worship and outdo one another. Were we victims of our circumstances or authors of our own trap? I genuinely don't think there's a cleaner or more important question you can ask about our species, and the fact that we can't fully answer it, that is not a gap in the story. That is the story. And it's about to get stranger, because just when the scholars thought they had the sequence roughly figured out, first farming, then surplus, then leisure, then eventually, way down the line, temples and gods and monumental religion, someone dug into a hill in Turkey and found something that shouldn't have been there. Something that turned the whole sequence upside down. I promised you we'd stand inside it. Come with me. Chapter 6. The Temple Before the Town. The hill is called Domus Tepe, which means, wonderfully, Klaus Hill, and it sits in southeastern Turkey overlooking a wide plain at the very northern tip of the fertile Crescent. For thousands of years, it was just a low mound with some old stones poking out, and in 1963, a survey team walked right over it, saw the broken slabs, decided it was probably a medieval graveyard, and moved on. That is one of my favorite facts in all of archaeology, that the most important prehistoric site on Earth sat there, noticed and dismissed, for another 30 years. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Potbelly came to have a look, and Schmidt understood within about a minute what he was standing on. He said later that he knew immediately he had two choices: to walk away and tell nobody, or to spend the rest of his life there. He chose the rest of his life. He married a Turkish woman, bought an old house in the nearby town, and dug into that hill every spring and autumn until the day he died, 20 years later, of a heart attack while swimming at 60. So what did he find? Picture it because it is genuinely hard to believe. Great circular enclosures, ringed with stone walls and benches, and rising out of them T-shaped pillars of limestone, some of them 5.5 meters tall, 17 feet, weighing up to 16 tons. Quarried from the bedrock 100 meters away, dragged up the hill and stood upright. And carved into them in relief a menagerie of wild animals. Snarling foxes, wild boars, snakes, scorpions, spiders, cranes, and above all vultures, again and again. Some of the pillars have arms carved down their sides, ending in human hands, with belts and loincloths, as if the T-shape itself is a stylized human being or something more than human. Schmidt looked at those faceless, armed, towering figures and said, "I think here we are face to face with the earliest representation of gods." Now, here is why this hill detonated the field. The oldest of these enclosures date to around 11,500 years ago. That is roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge. It is about 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid. One archaeologist put it in a way I've never forgotten. There is more time separating Göbekli Tepe from the first writing in ancient Sumer than separates Sumer from us. This is deep, deep time. And the builders, this is the part that overturns everything. The builders were hunter-gatherers. When work began on Göbekli Tepe, there is no evidence of a single domesticated crop, not one domesticated animal, no pottery, no metal. People who lived by hunting gazelle and gathering wild grain somehow organized themselves to quarry, move, carve, and raise 20-ton megaliths into patterned circles. And they fed the workforce. Archaeologists have sifted more than 100,000 animal bones from the site, and every identifiable one is wild: gazelle, boar, wild sheep, aurochs, and a dozen species of bird. There are hints of enormous stone vessels that some researchers think held early beer. This looks like feasting on a massive scale. It looks like hundreds of people gathering, again and again, to build something and to eat and drink together in its shadow. Do you see what that does to the story? For a century we assumed the sequence was, first you farm, then you get a food surplus, then you get free time and settled towns, and only much later, at the top of that pyramid of plenty, do you get monumental religion. Göbekli Tepe flips it. Here is monumental religion, or at least monumental something, built by people who hadn't farmed yet. And Klaus Schmidt drew the radical conclusion. He said, in effect, maybe it's backwards. Maybe the temple came first. Maybe the need to gather hundreds of people in one place, to feed them while they built and worshipped, created the demand for a reliable food supply. And that demand is what drove people to start cultivating the wild grain growing on the hills all around, some of which, we now know, was domesticated just a few miles away not long after. First the temple, Schmidt said, then the city. The great archaeologist Ian Hodder, no pushover, said Göbekli Tepe changes everything, that it overturns the whole apple cart, that here you can see socio-cultural change coming first and agriculture following after. I want you to feel how thrilling that is. And you knew a but was coming, because I promised you honesty, and honesty is the whole game here. I have to be careful and precise, because this is exactly the kind of site where a gorgeous story runs way ahead of the evidence, and where I have to protect you from the nonsense you will absolutely encounter out in the world. First, the honest scholarly correction. Since Schmidt died, his own successors, careful people like Lee Clare, have complicated his beautiful temple-first picture. It turns out Göbekli Tepe wasn't purely a ceremonial site with no residents. There are ordinary houses there, hearths, heaps of everyday flint tools, grinding stones, even a sophisticated system of carved cisterns for collecting rainwater. People didn't just visit to worship, they lived there. So the current, more sober view is that Göbekli Tepe was a settlement with a very strong ritual dimension, which is less tidy than the world's first temple, but more true. And an even earlier critic, Edward Banning, argued the whole thing might be misread, that the temples could be unusually grand houses, and that we're projecting our own categories of sacred and domestic onto people whose minds we cannot reconstruct. That caution deserves respect. The story is thrilling, the evidence is partial, and the honest thing, the more thrilling thing, actually, is to hold both at once. Something extraordinary and coordinated and probably sacred happened on this hill before farming, and we do not fully understand it. And now the nonsense, because I take protecting you seriously. You will run into people in documentaries, in best-selling books, all over the internet, who use Göbekli Tepe to sell you a fantasy, that it was built by survivors of a lost, advanced, Ice Age supercivilization, wiped out by a comet, whose refugees taught the poor primitive hunter-gatherers how to carve stone. This is the world of Graham Hancock and the so-called younger Dryas impact idea, and I want to be blunt. There is no evidence for it, and the excavation team has publicly and patiently debunked it over and over. The radiocarbon dates put the building of the site at the end of the cold snap, not before some imagined cataclysm. There was no lost Atlantis behind the hill. And here is why the fantasy actually offends me. It isn't just wrong, it's insulting. It cannot accept that ordinary hunter-gatherers, people with the same brilliant brains as you and me, could have done something this magnificent on their own. They could. They did. The truth that a society of foragers, with flint and rope and muscle and shared belief, raised the first monuments on Earth, is 1,000 times more astonishing than any lost civilization fairy tale. Don't let anyone sell you the cheaper story. Because Göbekli Tepe was not alone. In the surrounding region, we now know of a whole scatter of related sites with the same T-shaped pillars. The locals call them the Tash Tepela, the Stone Hills, including one called Karahan Tepe with over 250 pillars, only recently under the spade. This was a whole world of monument builders, a shared symbolic culture spread across the landscape, right at the dawn of everything. And whatever drew them together, gods, feasts, the dead, the sheer human need to gather and make meaning, it was tangled up from the very start with the grain growing on the hills. So let's go to that grain. Let's finally watch the thing itself, the moment a wild plant became a crop. Let's go back to the stubborn little stalk that would not let go. Chapter 7. The Grass That Would Not Let Go. I have been promising you this stalk since the first chapter, and now I get to keep the promise, because the domestication of plants is, to me, the single most beautiful and most misunderstood process in this entire story. Almost everyone gets it wrong in the same way, and the truth is so much better than the myth. Here is the myth. Some clever person, in the popular version it's usually a woman, noticing seeds sprouting from the household rubbish heap, has a flash of insight, a eureka moment, invents agriculture and teaches everyone else. It's a lovely image. It is also, as far as we can tell, completely false, and I want to be honest about that even though I'd love it to be true. There was no eureka. There was no inventor. Nobody set out to create a new kind of plant. What actually happened is stranger, slower, and in a way far more profound. We changed the plants without meaning to, and the plants, you could almost say, changed us right back. Let me take you inside the mechanism, because once you see it, you'll never unsee it. Go back to that field of wild wheat. A wild wheat plant has one overriding job, to fling its seeds onto the ground so they can grow next year. So it evolved a fragile little hinge holding each seed to the stalk, that rachis I mentioned, and the moment the grain is ripe, the hinge shatters at a touch or a gust of wind, and the seeds scatter. Brilliant design for a wild plant. Now, every so often, by random mutation, a single plant is born with a broken hinge, a tough rachis that doesn't shatter. It just stands there holding its ripe seed. In the wild, this plant is doomed. It can't scatter, it can't reproduce, its line ends. Natural selection ruthlessly weeds it out. But now walk a human being into that field with a sickle. What happens? When you cut ripe wild wheat and carry the bundle home, the shattering plants, the normal ones, the successful ones, have already dropped most of their seed back in the field. They're lost to you. But the mutants, the stubborn ones that wouldn't let go, their seed is still attached. It rides home in your bundle. And when next season you scatter some of that gathered seed to grow more, which of the seeds are you overwhelmingly planting? The stubborn ones, the mutants. Season after season, harvest after harvest, without any human intending it, without anyone even noticing, the sickle and the seed store quietly select for the plant that cannot survive without us. The tough rachis spreads. And a wild plant that scattered its own seed becomes a crop that depends entirely on human hands to reproduce. That is domestication, not an invention, a relationship, a slow, unconscious, mutual entanglement written one harvest at a time. And I want to be careful and honest, because there's a real debate about how fast this happened. An archaeologist named Gordon Hillman did experiments harvesting wild wheat and suggested the tough rachis type could come to dominate in as little as 20 or 30 years, startlingly fast. But when we look at the actual dirt, at the layered evidence from real sites, it looks much slower and messier, wild and domestic forms sitting side by side for 1,000 years or more. The truth probably varies by crop and place, but the direction is always the same. The plant that would not let go inherits the field. Now here's something that will surprise you, and it's one of my favorite corrections to the myth. For a long, long time, over 1,000 years, people cultivated these plants without really depending on them. At a site called Gilgal in the Jordan Valley, archaeologists found the world's oldest known granary, packed with thousands of wild barley grains from before the grain was even domesticated. People were gathering and storing and planting wild cereal 1,000 years before it became a proper crop, and even then, for centuries, it was a side dish. They kept right on hunting and gathering their favorite wild foods and treated the grain as a supplement. This is the deep truth the word, revolution, hides from you. For 100 generations, farming was a hobby, a hedge, a thing you did on the side. Nobody living through it could possibly have known they were remaking the world. That is what a real revolution looks like from the inside, like nothing much at all. The plants that got caught up in this in the Fertile Crescent are traditionally called the 8 founder crops, formalized by 2 botanists, Daniel Zohary and Maria Hopf. 3 cereals, Emma wheat, einkorn wheat, and barley. 4 pulses, lentil, pea, chickpea, and bitter vetch. And flax, which is the odd one out, the first plant we domesticated not for food, but for its fiber and oil, the ancestor of linen, of the first woven cloth that wasn't animal skin. There's a lovely detail there. People were twisting wild flax into cord 30,000 years ago in a cave in Georgia, long before anyone farmed anything. As always, the raw material of civilization was lying around for ages before we picked it up. And why here? Why did this happen in this particular arc of hills, and not, say, in Europe or southern Africa first? Part of the answer, argued famously by Jared Diamond, is just a lucky biological hand. This corner of the world happened to hold an extraordinary concentration of big-seeded, self-pollinating annual grasses that were easy to gather and easy to breed true, plus most of the large animals worth domesticating. It's not that the people were smarter. It's that the pantry was better stocked. Give human beings anywhere that same starting hand, Diamond argues, and they'd have done the same thing. I think there's a lot of truth in that, though honestly, it's not the whole story, because the Natufians had also spent thousands of years getting settled, storing food, building the social scaffolding, and that mattered too. It's never just the plants. It's the plants and the people tangled together. Let me leave you with my favorite of the founder crops because it tells you something true about how this all worked. Bitter vetch. You've probably never heard of it. It's a legume, and here's the thing, it's mildly poisonous to humans. It contains a toxin that makes it bitter, and you have to boil it in several changes of water before you can safely eat it, which is why the old botanical texts note, rather bleakly, that it was eaten only by the poorest people or in times of famine. And yet we domesticated it, and we grew it for 10,000 years, right up to the present day in some places. Why? Because it turned out to be excellent food for sheep and cattle, and it would grow on thin, terrible, alkaline soil where nothing else would. And that right there is the Neolithic in miniature, not a golden harvest of plenty. A stubborn, bitter little seed, half poison, grown on bad ground, feeding the animals and the desperate because it worked. First comes the barley, and sometimes first comes the bitter vetch. Now, those animals it fed, let's go find out where they came from. And I promised you the dog would come first. Chapter 8, Into the Firelight. The dog came first. Thousands of years before the first sheep, before the first goat, before anyone planted a seed, one wild animal crossed the line from out there to in here and settled down beside us at the fire. And I love that it was the dog because the dog didn't come to be eaten or milked or worked. The dog came to be a companion. Of all the animals we would eventually bend to our purposes, the very first one we let in as a friend. Now I have to be careful and honest here, because the origin of the dog is one of the most contested puzzles in this whole field, and anyone who tells you it's settled is overselling. Here's what we're fairly sure of. Dogs are descended from wolves, and this genuinely surprised the experts, not from the grey wolf you'd see today. One of the leading geneticists put it beautifully. For 100 years, everyone assumed the modern grey wolf was the ancestor, and we're very surprised that they're not. The real ancestor is an ancient, now extinct population of wolves that split off deep in the Ice Age, somewhere between 40,000 and 27,000 years ago. The grey wolf and the dog are more like cousins than parent and child. Exactly where and when the crossing happened, Siberia, the Middle East, Europe, East Asia, is still argued over, with new genetic studies reshuffling the picture every few years. The oldest bones everyone agrees are truly dog come from a cave in Spain, around 17,500 years ago, and there's a famous grave in Germany where a human and a dog were buried together 14,500 years ago. But how did it happen? The best idea we have is lovely because it means nobody set out to make a dog at all, just like nobody set out to make wheat. It's called the commensal pathway. Picture a hunter-gatherer camp with its scraps and its bones and its middens of waste. That's a free buffet for a wolf if the wolf can bear to come close. Most wolves can't, they're too fearful, they keep their distance. But every population has variation, and a few wolves are just a little bolder, a little calmer, willing to creep in for the easy meal. Those bolder wolves eat better, raise more pups, and pass on their tameness. Over generations, the camp itself selects for friendliness, not by anyone's design, but simply because the tamest animals got the food. And so a wolf slowly became a dog, tameness bred into it one scavenged bone at a time. There's even a physical signature of this. In domestic dogs, and in domestic pigs and sheep too, the part of the brain governing fear and aggression is dramatically smaller than in their wild relatives, by something like 40%. We didn't just tame their behavior, we reshaped their brains. And remember that old man at Ain Malaha, buried 12,000 years ago with his hand on a puppy. By that point, the friendship was already ancient. Then came the others, and their stories are all variations on the same theme. Not capture, not clever invention, but a slow tightening of a relationship that was already there. Sheep and goats came first among the livestock in the hills of the fertile Crescent, somewhere around 10 to 11,000 years ago. And here's a detail I adore. The first domestic sheep had no wool worth speaking of. Their coats were coarse hair. People kept them for meat and milk and skins, and plucked what little fluff they had by hand. The woolly sheep, the fleecy cloud we picture, came thousands of years later, bred deliberately once people realized what that fiber could become. The sheep you imagine is a late human invention laid over an early one. The pig is wonderful because we seem to have domesticated it at least twice, independently, once in the Near East, once in China, from completely different wild boar. And on the island of Cyprus, pigs turn up 11,000 years ago, on an island they could never have swum to, which means people put them in boats and carried them there, which means the relationship was already well underway. When Near Eastern pigs later arrived in Europe, they interbred so thoroughly with wild European boar that their genes are now overwhelmingly local. And yet they stayed domestic, a puzzle geneticists call domestication islands in the genome. The tameness held even as the ancestry washed away. And then there is cattle, and I have to pause on cattle because the ancestor of the placid cow chewing its cud in a field today was one of the most terrifying animals in the ancient world. It was called the Aurochs, and it was a monster. A bull could stand nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, weigh well over a ton, and carry horns longer than your arm. Julius Caesar saw them in the German forests and wrote that they were a little below the elephant in size, that their strength and speed are extraordinary, and that they spare neither man nor wild beast which they have espied. Think about the sheer nerve of the people who looked at that animal and decided to bring it under human control. We tamed the elephant-sized killing machine of the northern forests and turned it, over generations, into the dairy cow. The last wild aurochs, by the way, the very last one on Earth, died in a forest in Poland in the year 1627. A cow, not a bull. We drove the ancestor extinct while its domesticated children multiplied into the hundreds of millions. There is a whole meditation about us in that single fact. The person who has thought most clearly about how all of this worked is an archaeologist named Melinda Zeder, and she gives us 3 pathways, which I find genuinely clarifying. There's the commensal pathway, the dog, the cat, the animals that wandered into our niche on their own. There's the prey pathway, sheep, goat, cattle, pig, animals we hunted for ages, then began to manage, culling the young males, guarding the breeding females, sliding by degrees from hunting into herding without ever crossing a clear line. And much later, there's the directed pathway, the horse, the donkey, the camel, animals we deliberately went out and captured and tamed, but only after we already understood what domestication was and what it was for. And here is Zeder's deep point, the one that ties this whole chapter back to the wheat and forward to everything else. Along both of the early pathways, she writes, domestication was the unexpected outcome. Nobody planned it. Nobody woke up and decided to invent livestock. We stumbled into these partnerships the way you stumble into most of the important things in a life. Gradually, half blindly, and then one day you look up and the world has completely changed and you can't remember choosing any of it. I'll give you one last fact to carry, because it's the kind of thing that genuinely keeps me up at night. The total weight, the biomass, of the cattle alone that we have bred now exceeds the combined weight of every wild mammal left on Earth. Every elephant, every whale, every deer and mouse and bat, all of it outweighed by our cows. The relationship that began with one bold wolf creeping toward a campfire has, in 11,000 years, physically rebuilt the animal life of the planet. The Neolithic isn't something that happened. It's something that is still happening right now at industrial scale. Hold that. We'll come back to it at the very end. For now, let's follow these people and their new plants and animals indoors, because the next thing they built might be the most consequential invention of all. Not the farm, the house. Chapter 9. The Invention of Indoors. I want to make a case that sounds absurd at first and then, I hope, becomes obvious. That one of the most revolutionary things our species ever invented was the wall. The permanent, durable, stay-in-one-place wall, the idea of indoors. Because think about what a house actually is. It's a claim. It says, this ground is mine or ours, and I will be here tomorrow, and next year, and my children will be here after me. No hunter-gatherer walking the land ever needed to say that. The house is where property and memory and inheritance and 100 other things we'll get to all begin. So let me take you into the first real houses and the first real town on Earth. Start at Jericho, yes, that Jericho, where beside a spring that never failed, people began building permanent homes around 11,000 years ago, right as the Great Cold Snap ended. Round houses of sun-dried mud brick, packed close. And then, around 10,300 years ago, the people of Jericho built something that still stuns me. A massive stone wall around their town, and against the inside of it, a solid stone tower, over 8 meters tall, with a staircase of 22 steps spiraling up through its dark interior. Sit with the numbers on that tower. It was, by one estimate, something like 11,000 working days of labor, 100 people laboring more than 100 days. And it was, as far as we know, the tallest thing human beings had ever built, and it stayed the tallest for around 4,000 years, until the first Egyptian pyramid. And here's the mystery I love about it. We don't actually know what it was for. The old assumption was defense, a wall and a tower, obviously a fortification. But there's very little sign of warfare in this time and place, and the tower is inside the wall, which is a strange spot for a lookout. Kathleen Kenyon, the formidable archaeologist who excavated it, wondered if the wall was against floods. And then 2 Israeli researchers ran the numbers and found something eerie. At sunset on the longest day of the year, the shadow of the nearest mountain falls precisely on the tower first, and then spreads across the whole town. They think it may have been a monument of power and awe, a tower of power. One of them called it a psychological instrument to inspire the reluctant, to bind people into this strange, new, crowded communal life, to convince them the effort and the closeness were worth it. We may never know. But I find that possibility haunting, that one of humanity's first monuments may have been built not to keep enemies out, but to keep ourselves in, to make people believe in the village. Now let me take you to my favorite Neolithic place of all, because it is so strange and so intimate that once you understand how people lived there, you will never forget it. It's called Catalhoyuk in central Turkey, and it flourished around 9,000 years ago. Up to several thousand people lived there, and here is the astonishing part: there were no streets. None. The houses were packed together wall to wall to wall, a solid honeycomb of mud brick homes with no alleys, no lanes, no doors at ground level. You entered your house through a hole in the roof, climbing down a wooden ladder into the room below. The rooftops were the streets. Picture it, a whole town's worth of people, walking and working and talking across a continuous landscape of flat roofs, dropping down through holes into the smoky rooms where they lived. The same ceiling hole that let you in let the smoke of your hearth out. You lived, cooked, slept, gave birth, and died in the same shaft of light falling through that opening. And they kept those homes immaculate. The walls and the raised platforms where they slept were plastered smooth and painted a brilliant white, and replastered again and again, layer upon layer. Rubbish went outside to great middens. The inside was kept scrupulously clean. Ian Hodder, who excavated it for decades, once affectionately called the inhabitants plaster freaks. They were obsessed with resurfacing their gleaming white world. And beneath those clean white floors, Beneath the very platforms where they slept, they buried their dead. We'll come to what that means in a couple of chapters, because it deserves its own reckoning. For now, just hold the image. A family lying down to sleep each night on a plastered platform with their grandmother's bones a few inches below them in the earth. The dead and the living under one roof, separated by a skin of white plaster. That is a relationship to death, and to home, so different from ours that it should make the hair on your arms stand up. One more sight, because it gives us something almost unbearably poignant. At a place called Ain Ghazal in Jordan in 1983, archaeologists found a pit, and inside it, buried carefully underground, a cache of statues. Human figures made of lime plaster molded over bundles of reeds, some of them nearly a meter tall, among the oldest large-scale human statues anywhere in the world, made around 9,000 years ago. They have wide, staring eyes, the irises outlined in black bitumen, some set with a glinting green mineral. And nobody knows for certain who they were meant to be. Ancestors, maybe, the honored dead, given a body in plaster, or something else entirely. One researcher who studied them said something I keep returning to. What if these aren't representations at all? What if they weren't statues of people, but were felt to be, in some sense, alive themselves, and were buried carefully in pristine condition because they had died or because their power had run out? We found them, she said, and they bring up equally many questions as answers. I love that honesty. 11 great staring plaster faces made by people who buried their dead beneath their beds, and we can only stand in front of them and wonder. Which is, maybe, exactly what they were made for. So we have the house, the wall, the tower, the town, the statue, the dead underfoot. We've built the stage. Now I want to do the thing I most love to do in any of these stories. I want to come down to street level, or in this case rooftop level, and spend an ordinary day inside one of these homes. Because the people are where my heart is. Let me show you a single Neolithic day. Chapter 10. A Day Beneath the Floor. Come with me into a house at Catalhoyuk 9,000 years ago at dawn. I want to fill in your senses, because this is where these people stop being a story about agriculture and become, simply, people as real as you, waking up to a day. The first thing is the sound. Bleating sheep and goats, pennied up on the rooftops and in yards, complaining at the light. Then the smell, smoke, 100 hearths worth of it, threading up through 100 roof holes, carrying the scent of burning dung and reed and the roasting of grain. Inside the house, in the shaft of light from the ceiling, a woman kneels at a grinding stone, a quern pushing a smaller stone back and forth across it, stone on stone, turning hard emmer wheat into flour, hour after hour. That rhythmic grinding sound, muffled through mud-brick walls, was the heartbeat of the Neolithic morning in every village on Earth for thousands of years. And it had a price written into the body. When we dig up these women, their toe bones are damaged from kneeling, their spines compressed from the downward grind, their teeth worn flat and full of grit, because stone grinding sheds stone dust, and every loaf of bread came with a little sand in it, filing the teeth down year after year. This is the texture of the bargain in a single body. Bread every day, and your teeth ground to stumps by the time you're old. Let's talk about that food, though, because it was better than grim gruel, and I want to be fair to them. From the residues in their pots and the seeds in their stores, we know they ate a real cuisine, wheat and barley, yes, but also lentils, peas, bitter vetch, almonds and pistachios gathered from the hills, the meat of cattle and sheep and fish and birds. Their pottery held mixes of grain and pulse and dairy. Some vessels may even have been reserved for special foods, like milk and whey. These were not people choking down survival rations. They were cooking. And because I can never resist this kind of detail, at a related site far to the north, in Orkney off the coast of Scotland, a place called Skara Brae, Residue in a pot revealed a drink brewed from oats and barley and laced with hemlock, deadly nightshade and henbane, hallucinogenic and lethal in the wrong dose. Somebody, 5,000 years ago, was brewing something powerful and strange. I'm not going to pretend I know what it was for, but I love that it existed. Even at the dawn of farming, human beings wanted, sometimes, to leave their own heads. Let me take you to Skara Brae for a moment, actually, because it's the best preserved Neolithic village in northern Europe, and it makes these people startlingly close. On a treeless, wind-swept island they built their houses of stone, and because there was no wood, they made the furniture of stone too, and it survived. You can walk into a 5,000-year-old house at Skara Brae and see, still standing, a stone dresser against the far wall, the first thing you'd see coming in. Stone box beds on either side of a central hearth. Little stone tanks in the floor, their seams sealed with clay to hold water, maybe to keep shellfish bait alive. There's a bigger bed on the right and a smaller on the left in house after house, and an archaeologist noticed this matched a custom that survived in the Scottish Islands into modern times. The husband's bed larger, the wife's smaller, and in some of the smaller beds they found beads and paint pots. You are looking across 5,000 years at somebody's bedroom and at the small, unequal arrangements of a marriage. It gives me chills. Now I have to return to the dead, because I glossed over it before and it's too important. At Catalhoyuk they buried their people beneath the floors. Over 400 skeletons have been recovered from under those houses. In one case, 64 individuals under a single dwelling. The bodies were tucked into tight, curled positions, wrapped in mats or placed in baskets, and laid in the earth beneath the sleeping platforms. And sometimes, later, they came back and removed the skull. We find the plastered floors resealed above, and the skulls turning up elsewhere in the village, sometimes plastered over with a new face and painted and passed around, and eventually reburied. There is one burial I cannot stop thinking about. A woman laid in the ground, curled up, her arms crossed over her chest, and cradled in those arms, held against her, the plastered skull of another person, an older woman. Somebody who loved them both arranged that. We cannot know the story, but we can know the love or the grief or the reverence, some enormous human feeling that put a painted skull into the arms of the dead. 9,000 years, and it reaches you, doesn't it? It reaches me every time. There's a pattern in the pigments, too, that I find deeply moving in its ordinariness. When they painted the bodies of the dead, the men were colored with red cinnabar, and the women with blue and green, azurite and malachite. Little distinctions, gendered even in death 9,000 years ago. And here's a finding that genuinely surprised the scientists. When they measured the correlation, the houses with more burials underneath them had more layers of wall painting. The more dead you held, the more you painted. As if the art on the walls and the bodies in the floor were somehow part of the same act, decorating the house of the living and the dead at once. Let me leave this ordinary, extraordinary day with two things the newest science has told us, because they overturn old assumptions in ways I find wonderful. First, for a long time people painted Catalhoyuk as a peaceful, equal place, and in one crucial way that seems to have been true, the isotopes in the bones show that men and women ate essentially the same food, and by the evidence we have, held essentially equal status. Ian Hodder concluded there was a balance of power between the sexes. Now, we'll complicate the equality story later, because inequality was quietly creeping in even here. But hold the finding. At the dawn of village life, women and men seem to have stood, roughly, as equals. And second, from a genetic study just published, we learned how the households were organized, and it was through the mothers. The line ran from mother to daughter. The women stayed in the houses they were born in, and the men married in and moved. A matrilineal, matrilocal world. Not the mother goddess fantasy we'll have to dismantle in a couple of chapters. This is harder, drier, better evidence than that, but a real and specific truth about how these families were held together. Women were the thread. The house passed down the female line, with the ancestors sleeping in the floor to prove the claim. That's a Neolithic day. The grinding stone, the smoke, the plastered white walls, the good food and the ground-down teeth, the dead in the earth beneath the bed, the near equality of women and men, the household running through the mothers. Ordinary life in the first age of settled humanity. Now let's look at the things their hands made, the pots and axes and cloth that fill up that house. Because the Neolithic toolkit is where you can watch human ingenuity remaking the material world, and it has a twist at the end that changed Eurasia forever. Chapter 11: Pots, Axes, and the Second Skin. I want to start this chapter by breaking a myth you've almost certainly absorbed without noticing, because it clears the ground for everything else. The myth is that pottery was a farmer's invention, that once people settled down and had grain to store, they figured out how to bake clay into pots. It's tidy. It's wrong. The oldest pottery vessels in the world come from a cave in China around 20,000 years ago, made by hunter-gatherers, thousands of years before farming, and thousands of miles from the Fertile Crescent. Ice Age foragers were firing clay long before anyone sowed a field. And here's the detail that delights me most, because it stands the whole farming came first logic on its head. The people who built Jericho's tower, who raised Göbekli Tepe, who first domesticated wheat and sheep, they had no pottery at all. We literally name their era the pre-pottery Neolithic because they did the hardest parts of the revolution, the monuments, the crops, the herds, the towns, entirely without a single fired clay pot. They stored grain in plastered bins and baskets and stone bowls. For something like 3,000 or 4,000 years, people farmed without pottery. When it finally arrived in the Near East, it wasn't a breakthrough that enabled civilization. It was a convenience that showed up late to a party civilization had already thrown. I love that, because it's such a good reminder that the story never runs in the neat order we expect. But when pottery did settle in, it mattered, because a fired pot lets you do new things. You can store liquids and keep out the damp and the rodents. And crucially, you can cook in a way you couldn't before, set a pot right in the fire and boil things slowly for hours, which transforms tough grains and pulses into soft, digestible food. And this matters more than it sounds, into soft food you can feed a baby. Hold that thought about baby food. It's going to turn out to be one of the most consequential facts in this entire episode, and it's not the fact you'd expect. Then there's the tool that literally gave the age its name, the New Stone Age, named for a new way of making stone tools. Older stone tools were chipped, flaked into shape. Neolithic people ground and polished their stone, rubbing tough rock against abrasive stone with sand and water for hours until they had a smooth, heavy, durable edge. And the masterpiece of this technology was the polished stone axe, because the polished stone axe is the tool that let human beings do something we had never really done before, take down the forest. This is not a small thing. Across Europe, the spread of farming and the spread of the polished axe are the same event, because to make a field you first have to kill the trees. I told you earlier about the experiment where researchers took a Neolithic axe, a tool we dismissed as crude, and felled an oak more than a foot thick in under half an hour. These weren't primitive choppers. They were precision instruments, and some of the finest, polished to a mirror sheen and traded hundreds of miles from where the stone was quarried, were clearly too beautiful to be mere tools. They were treasures, status, maybe sacred. We took the humble job of cutting wood, and, being human, made some of the axes into art. And then there's cloth, which I think of as the second skin, the technology that let us live where our bodies alone couldn't. People had twisted plant fiber into cord for tens of thousands of years, but the Neolithic is when weaving became systematic, driven by domesticated flax for linen, and later by that great invention I mentioned, the woolly sheep. The loom appears, a vertical frame with rows of clay or stone weights holding the threads under tension, and spindle whorls, the little weighted discs for spinning thread, become some of the most common objects on any Neolithic site, because spinning was constant, endless, something you did with your hands while you talked or watched the children. And we have one astonishing window into all of this, a real person, dressed. Ötzi, the man who died in the Alps around 5,300 years ago and froze into the ice, so complete that we have his clothes, and his wardrobe demolishes any idea that these were people in crude skins. His outfit was made from at least 5 different animals, each chosen for its properties: a coat and leggings of goat and sheep leather, a bearskin cap with a chin strap, shoes with bearskin soles and deer-hide uppers, and a woven grass net inside stuffed with soft grass for insulation, all under a woven grass cloak that shed the rain. A modern researcher who reconstructed his shoes said he became convinced that even 5,300 years ago, people had the equivalent of a cobbler, a specialist who made shoes for others. This was materials engineering. This was a person who knew exactly which animal's skin did which job, dressed for the high, cold mountains with more sophistication than most of us could manage if you dropped us up there today. I want to end this chapter with an idea that sounds technical and is actually one of the deepest turns in the whole human story. An archaeologist named Andrew Sherratt called it the secondary products revolution, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. When you first domesticate an animal, you use it for one thing: its body. Its meat, its hide, its bones. You kill it and you use it up. That's a primary product. But at some point, and the timing is debated, which we'll respect, people realized that a living animal could give you things over and over without dying. Milk, wool, and muscle power, an ox pulling a plow, dragging a cart. These are secondary products, and they change everything, because now the animal is not a stored meal, it's a machine, a renewable engine of food and fiber and force. Milk residue trapped in ancient pottery has pushed the dairying story back deep into the Neolithic. People were milking their animals far earlier than Sherratt first guessed. And think about what milk means. It means an adult can drink the food meant for a calf, that a herd becomes a daily supply and not just a slaughter. Think about what the plow means. One person and an ox can now farm land that would break 10 people with digging sticks. The whole scale of what humans could grow, and therefore how many humans there could be, and therefore how much surplus a few could pile up and control, all of it ratchets upward from these renewable animals. We'll follow every one of those threads, but it starts here with the quiet, world-tilting realization that you don't have to kill the goat to eat. So they had their pots and their axes and their cloth and their milk and their plows. They had a whole material world, but human beings do not live by tools alone. And nowhere is the strangeness and the depth of these people clearer than in what they did with their gods and their dead. I've been promising you a reckoning with the dead beneath the floor, and with a goddess I'm going to have to be very honest with you about. It's time. Chapter 12. The Dead Who Would Not Leave. There is a practice from this world that I find more haunting than anything else in it, and I've been holding it back until now because it deserves your full attention. Across the Levant, between about 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, people did something extraordinary with their dead. They would bury a body beneath the floor of the house, and then, sometime later, they would dig down and remove the skull. They would take that bare skull and they would rebuild the face on it in plaster, modeling cheeks, a nose, a brow, sculpting a human face back onto the bone. They would set shells into the eye sockets for eyes. They would paint it, suggest hair, sometimes a moustache. and then they would keep it in the house, among the living. These are called plastered skulls, and when you see one, the Jericho skull in the British Museum is around 9,000 years old. You are looking at one of the oldest attempts in human history to hold on to a specific human face after death. A scholar who studied them wrote of a remarkable sophistication in the treatment of the human visage, of a craftsperson in full command, capturing the anatomy, the brow, the dreamy expression of the eyes. The Ashmolean Museum in Oxford simply calls its plastered skull the oldest portrait it owns. Now, I have to be honest, because I promised, we don't actually know if these were meant as portraits, meant to capture a particular person's likeness, or whether that's us projecting our own idea of a portrait backward onto them. But whatever they were, the impulse behind them is unmistakable, and it is heartbreakingly familiar. Someone died, and the people who loved them or feared them or needed them could not let the face go. So they gave it a new one and kept it close. Ancestor worship, most scholars think, the dead kept present, their power retained in the household. Some suggest darker possibilities, trophies of enemies. But when I stand in front of the tender, dreaming, shell-eyed face of a 9,000-year-old skull, I don't see a trophy. I see grief and love and the oldest refusal there is, the refusal to let the dead be gone. That refusal is everywhere in this world. The dead buried beneath the sleeping platforms, the skulls circulated and cradled, the plaster statues of Ain Guzzle with their staring eyes. And it makes a strange kind of sense, when you think about it, that settling down would transform our relationship with death. A forager who moves on leaves the dead behind in the ground at the old camp, but a farmer stays. The farmer lives for a lifetime and for generations on the exact same ground where the dead are buried. You cannot walk away from your ancestors. They are under your floor. They are, in a sense, the deed to your house, the proof that this land is yours because your people are in it. Death and property and home fuse together here at the very beginning, and they've never fully come apart since. Now I have to keep a harder promise. I told you we would meet the Mother Goddess, and that I'd have to be honest with you about her, and this is one of those places where the honesty is the whole point, so slow down with me. At Catalhoyuk, the excavators found figurines, thousands of them, small clay figures. And the first great excavator of the site, a man named James Mellart, working in the 1960s, seized on a particular one. A stout, seated woman, apparently giving birth, flanked by two big cats, her hands resting on their heads. The seated woman found in a grain bin. Mellart built from figures like her a sweeping vision. That Catalhoyuk was the heart of a peaceful, woman-centered, goddess-worshipping religion, a mother goddess cult, a lost matriarchal Eden before patriarchy and war. And this idea escaped the academy and became enormous. It fused with the 20th century goddess movement, with a Lithuanian-American archaeologist named Marija Gimbutas, who argued for a peaceful, goddess-worshipping, old Europe, destroyed by warlike patriarchal invaders. It became, for a lot of people, a beautiful and consoling story about who we used to be and who we might be again. And here is where I have to be careful and honest, because this is exactly the kind of place where a good story outruns the evidence, and where I owe you the truth even though the truth is less comforting. When Ian Hodder returned to Catalhoyuk in the 1990s with modern methods and dug up not a handful but thousands of figurines, the pattern shattered the theory. Over 90% of the figurines are animals, not women. Fewer than 5% are recognizably female. There is no evidence of a temple, no separate religious buildings, no sign of a priesthood or a goddess cult ruling the town. Hodder said it plainly. Catalhoyuk is perhaps best known for the idea of the mother goddess. But our work more recently has tended to show that, in fact, there is very little evidence of a mother goddess, and very little evidence of some sort of female-based matriarchy. That's just one of the many myths that the modern scientific work is undermining. And it gets more troubling. Some of Melart's most iconic images, certain wall paintings, certain figures that anchored the goddess story, later scholars have argued Melart may have partly invented, embellished, or fabricated. He'd already been banned from Turkey over an earlier scandal involving drawings of treasures that conveniently vanished. So some of the very foundation stones of the goddess story may never have existed at all. I want to be really careful about what I'm and am not saying, because this matters and people get sloppy in both directions. I am not telling you these people didn't revere the female or the mother or fertility. Female figurines are real and they are widespread, from the Levant to Anatolia to Europe, across thousands of years. There is clearly something powerful and shared in the image of the woman. And Gimbutas, whatever the excesses of her goddess theory, turned out to be right about a completely different thing. Her idea that later invaders swept in from the steppe has been strikingly confirmed by ancient DNA, and we'll get to that. So I'm not dismissing anyone. What I'm telling you is narrower, and I think more interesting. The specific, seductive story of a single peaceful mother goddess religion ruling a matriarchal Neolithic paradise. That story, as a proven fact, does not survive contact with the evidence. And one of Hodder's own figurines shows you why the truth is richer than the myth. It's a female form, full-breasted in front, but turn it around, and the back is a skeleton, ribs and vertebrae and pelvis, carefully carved. Hodder said it could be read as a woman turning into an ancestor, as a woman associated with death, or as death and life conjoined. That's not a fertility goddess. That's something deeper and stranger, and more honest, life and death held in one small clay body, in the hands of people who slept above their own dead every night. So here is what I'd ask you to carry out of this chapter. These were profoundly spiritual people, wrestling with death and ancestry and the female power to make life, in ways we can feel but cannot fully decode. Their gods, if that's even the right word, had no faces on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe and too many faces on the plastered skulls. We should honor how much they clearly felt and resist the temptation, theirs would-be interpreter's temptation, to force it into a tidy religion that flatters our own longings. The reverent, honest answer is, here is what we are sure of, here is our best guess, and here, still, is a mystery we get to keep. And now I have to turn from what they believed to what their bodies suffered, because it's time to open the confession I've been promising since the very first chapter. It's time to read the bones. Chapter 13, What the Bones Confess. I told you at the very beginning that when you dig up the first farmers, their bodies read like a confession. Now I'm going to make good on that, and I need you to brace a little, because this is the chapter where the bargain at the heart of our whole story stops being an abstraction and becomes flesh and bone. This is where farming presents its bill. Start with height because it's the simplest and the most shocking. Measure the skeletons of the hunter-gatherers of the late Ice Age in Europe and the Near East, and the men stand around 5 feet 10, the women around 5 feet 5 or 6. Then farming arrives, and the bodies shrink. Within the Neolithic, average height for men in Europe falls to around 5 foot 5, for women to around 5 foot 1, a loss of something like 5 inches. 5 inches gone from the human body, and here is the part that ought to stop you cold. In some of those regions, average height did not climb back to Ice Age levels until the 20th century. 10,000 years. It took 10,000 years and the entire machinery of modern medicine and nutrition to grow back what farming took away in a few centuries. And it's not just Europe. The same collapse in stature shows up as agriculture arrives in India, in the Nile Valley, in the Americas, over and over, independently. The bodies got smaller wherever the fields spread. Why? Because the farmer's diet, for all its abundance of calories, was a nutritional catastrophe compared to the foragers. Remember the Kung drawing on over 100 wild plant species. The farmer collapsed that diversity down to a tiny handful of crops in the Fertile Crescent, essentially wheat, barley, and a few pulses. Lots of calories, yes, but low in protein, low in iron, low in the micronutrients scattered across a wild diet. You can be stuffed with bread and starving of everything else. And the bones record exactly that starvation in signatures you can read with your naked eye. There's a condition called porotic hyperostosis, where chronic iron deficiency anemia makes the bone of the skull go spongy and pitted as the marrow desperately tries to make more blood cells, and it becomes dramatically more common in farmers. There are lines in the teeth, enamel defects, each one a frozen moment when a child's body, fighting hunger or illness, stopped building enamel, and farmers' teeth are full of them. There are lines across the long bones marking growth that stopped and started with the seasons of famine. Every one of these is a small written record of a body under siege. And then the teeth. The farmer's mouth is, forgive me, a crime scene. Those sticky, sugary, starchy cereal gruels and breads fed the bacteria that make acid that dissolves enamel, and dental cavities exploded in frequency with the arrival of agriculture. The foragers, eating tough, varied wild food, had comparatively good teeth. The farmers' teeth rotted in their heads. If you ever needed a single image for the whole trade-off, it's that. We invented bread, and bread invented the cavity. But the deepest cost, the one that would shape all of human history to come, wasn't in the diet at all. It was in the crowding and the animals. Gather human beings into dense permanent villages, pile up their waste, contaminate their water, and pack them in beside herds of sheep and goats and cattle and pigs. And you have built, for the first time in the history of our species, a perfect machine for making disease. Most of the great killers that would stalk humanity for the next 10,000 years came out of the Neolithic barnyard. Measles appears to have evolved from a cattle plague. Influenza churns endlessly out of pigs and ducks. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and a long, grim list of others crossed into us from the animals we now lived pressed against, or bred in the filth of settlement. We even have direct molecular proof now, ancient DNA showing a human-adapted strain of Salmonella infecting agropastoralists 5,500 years ago. Foragers, spread thin and always moving, could not sustain these crowd diseases. There weren't enough hosts packed close enough. Farming built the crowd, and the crowd bred the plague. And I want to be honest about a hard limit on our knowledge here, because it actually makes the picture darker, not lighter. The skeleton only records the slow diseases that scar bone. The fast, explosive epidemics, the ones that kill you in a week, leave no mark at all, which means everything I'm describing is almost certainly an undercount. The bones confess the slow suffering. The fast dying we mostly can't even see. So here we arrive back at Jarred Diamond and his incendiary title, the worst mistake in the history of the human race. Shorter, sicker, more anemic, rottener teeth, ridden with new diseases, dead younger. He wrote that with agriculture came the gross social and sexual inequality, the disease and despotism that curse our existence. And when you're standing over the actual bones, it is very hard to argue with him. This is the confession the skeletons make, and it is damning. And yet, and I have to be careful and honest, because the honesty is where the real thinking lives, I don't think mistake is quite the right word, and here's why. A mistake implies a chooser, someone who could have known better and picked wrong. But we've seen all episode that nobody chose this. There was no committee, no vote, no moment of decision. There was a stubborn stalk that rode home in a bundle, a bold wolf at the fire, a slow tightening of dependencies that no single person could see whole. And there's a genuinely elegant idea from two researchers, Wells and Stock, that reframes the whole paradox. Think of the body's energy as a budget that has to be split four ways: growth, maintenance, defense against disease, and reproduction. The farming life, crowded, infected, calorie-rich but nutrient-poor, forced a reallocation. More energy had to go to fighting off constant infection, and more went to reproduction because, and here's the twist that ties back to that pot of baby food I told you to remember, the farmers could suddenly have babies far faster, which left less for growth, so bodies got smaller, and less for maintenance, so they wore out sooner. In other words, natural selection in the New World didn't favor the tall, healthy, long-lived individual. It favored whoever could pump out the most surviving children, sick and short though they were. Quality was traded for quantity, not by anyone's choice, but by the brute arithmetic of the new niche. And that reframing sets up the single strangest fact in this entire story, the one that makes the worst mistake, idea almost collapse under its own weight. If farming made us shorter, sicker, and more miserable, then how, in the name of everything, did it produce the greatest population explosion in the history of our species before the modern age? How did the sick, stunted farmers absolutely bury the healthy foragers in sheer numbers until foraging, humanity's way of life for 300,000 years, became a rounding error? The bones say farming was a disaster for the individual, and yet farming conquered the earth. That is not a contradiction to sweep under the rug. That is the master key to the whole thing, and it's where we go next. Chapter 14. A World Filling Up. So let me put the paradox to you as plainly as I can, because it really is the hinge of everything. Farming shrank the body. Farming rotted the teeth, thinned the blood, filled the villages with plague. By every measure written into the individual skeleton, it was a step down. And in the very same breath, in the very same centuries, it did the opposite of what all that suffering should predict. It made us many, not a little more numerous. Overwhelmingly, planet-conqueringly more numerous. I want you to hold both of those facts in your two hands at once, because the resolution of that contradiction is, for my money, one of the deepest and least appreciated ideas in the whole human story. It is the answer to a riddle. And the answer is going to sound almost too small for the size of the thing it explains. First, let me give you the scale of what needs explaining. Roughly 11,500 years ago, at the very dawn of all this, the total number of human beings on the entire planet was something like 4 million. 4 million people. That is about half the population of present-day London, scattered across every continent our species had reached. And for tens of thousands of years before that, the number had barely moved. Forager populations were, to a first approximation, flat. Births roughly balanced deaths, generation after generation, and the long-term growth rate was, as near as we can measure it, indistinguishable from zero. Humanity idled. For an unimaginable stretch of time, we were a rare animal on a mostly empty earth. Then farming arrives, and the line that had lain flat for ages bends upward, and it does not come back down for thousands of years. That is the population explosion the bones set up, and now I get to tell you how we actually know it happened, because the how is gorgeous. You cannot go and take a census of the dead. There is no register, but there is a trick, and it comes from a French demographer named Jean-Pierre Boccapel, who is the hero of this chapter. Boccapel realized that a growing population and a stable one leave different fingerprints in a graveyard, specifically in the age of the people buried there. When a population is booming, it is disproportionately young. More babies survived last year than the year before, so at any given moment there is a bulge of children and teenagers relative to adults. So if you go into ancient cemeteries and count the proportion of skeletons who died between the ages of about 5 and 19, he called it the juvenility index. A rising population and a flat one give you different numbers. And when researchers did exactly that, across dozens and dozens of European cemeteries straddling the transition to farming, the signal was unmistakable. In the forager cemeteries from before agriculture, the juvenility index sits low and, as one team put it, shows no evidence for any pattern other than a stationary population. Flat, idling, just as we said. And then agriculture arrives, and the index jumps, a clean, statistically solid leap upward that shows up not just in Europe, but wherever farming took hold, at whatever date it happened to arrive. In the Levant first, then Europe, then East Asia, then, thousands of years later and entirely independently, in the American Southwest. The same wave, breaking on different shores at different times. That is about as close as prehistory ever lets you get to watching a thing happen. The graveyards themselves are telling you, here, right here, the babies started surviving. So now the real question. Why? And here is where the answer turns out to be startlingly intimate, almost domestic. It was not, as you might first guess, that people started dying less. In fact, and this is the part that inverts everything you think you know about population growth, death almost certainly went up. We just spent a whole chapter on the plagues and the rotten teeth and the anemia. The villages were death traps, and infants died in them at ferocious rates. The modern world got more numerous by dying less. The Neolithic world got more numerous by the exact opposite route. It got more numerous by being born more. This was a transition driven by the cradle, not by the sickbed. Bokyapel put it about as sharply as it can be put. The Neolithic demographic transition was caused by an abrupt increase in birth rates, not a decrease in death rates. Births simply outran deaths, even as both climbed, and a population growing at even a fraction of 1% a year, sustained across centuries, becomes a flood. But why would farming women have more babies? And this is the moment I get to pay off something I asked you to hold on to chapters ago, that humble pot of soft grain mush I called baby food. Remember it. Here is what it did. Picture a hunter-gatherer mother, a Kung woman of the Kalahari, whom anthropologists actually watched and measured. She is on the move, foraging, and her infant is on her hip or her back all day long. And she nurses that child constantly. Researchers clocked it at around 4 times an hour, on and off all day, for years. Now there is a quiet piece of biology hidden in that rhythm. Frequent, sustained suckling keeps a hormone called prolactin high, and high prolactin suppresses ovulation. The body, in effect, will not start another pregnancy while it is pouring everything into the one child already at the breast. The result is that forager children are spaced far apart, roughly 4 years between births, not by any decision, but by the sheer metabolic honesty of a nursing, walking body. A mobile mother simply cannot carry 2 infants and a toddler across a landscape. Her biology enforces what her life demands. Now take that same body and set it down in a village next to a pot. She no longer walks all day. And she has, for the first time in human history, a food soft enough to feed a baby that is not breast milk, emmer and einkorn and barley, boiled down to a warm, swallowable gruel. So she can wean earlier. The child comes off the breast and onto the mush at, say, a year or so instead of 3 or 4. And the moment the constant suckling stops, the prolactin falls, ovulation returns, and she can conceive again. The gap between births collapses from around 4 years to around 2. Do that arithmetic across a reproductive lifetime, and each woman can bear roughly twice as many children. That is the engine. That is the whole secret. The population of the Earth pivoted on a bowl of porridge and the hormone chemistry of weaning. A man named Sussman guessed at a piece of this back in the 1970s, before anyone had the cemetery data. He pointed out, simply, that once you no longer have to carry your child, you can have more of them. The graveyards came along decades later and proved the intuition right. I find that a genuinely beautiful example of how this science works. A hunch about a mother and a baby, confirmed by counting the dead. And there is a second gift the fields gave the mother, on top of the weaning food. Calories. Raw, dependable, close-to-home calories. Chasing game and gathering wild plants is metabolically expensive and unreliable. A granary of grain is a bulk energy subsidy sitting in your own house. Bocchiapel framed it as a rewriting of the mother's entire energy budget, less spent on movement and hauling children across the land, more available to pour into pregnancy after pregnancy. Sedentism plus starch equals babies. The same crowded, infected, nutrient-poor life that was shrinking everyone's bones was, at the very same time, supercharging the birth rate. Those are not two separate stories. They are the same trade, seen from two ends. Quality down, quantity up, and quantity, it turns out, is what wins the planet. A shorter, sicker people who simply make more of themselves will, given a few thousand years, inherit the earth from a taller, healthier people who do not. Natural selection does not care whether you are happy. It counts descendants. And by that pitiless ledger, the farmers won in a landslide. But and I promised you honesty, so here comes the shadow across this whole triumphant picture. The boom did not roll on smoothly forever. When researchers reconstructed these population curves in fine detail across Neolithic Europe, they found something that genuinely shocked them, and it should shake us too. The growth came in a great surge. Yes, populations doubling roughly every 4 centuries, which for humans is breakneck. But then, again and again, region after region, the line did not level off gently. It crashed. After the boom came the bust, long declines in which populations fell by 20% on average, and in some places, Britain among them, by figures approaching the death toll of the Black Death. Whole landscapes that had filled with farmers emptied out again. And here is the unsettling part. When they checked these collapses against the climate record, there was very little correlation. The weather did not do this. Something in the system itself did some deadly interplay of soil exhaustion and crowding and disease, and perhaps the simple violence of too many people wanting the same good land. We will get to that violence very soon, and it is worse than you think. So the demographic revolution was not a smooth ascent to glory. It was a boom-and-bust ratchet, surge, crash, surge again, each cycle leaving a little more humanity on the board than before. The farmers filled the world not in one clean rising line, but in a series of gambles, expansions into fragility, populations climbing higher than their land could safely hold, and then paying for it. And I want you to hold that shape in mind, growth that outruns its own foundation and then collapses, because it is not only a fact about the Neolithic. One of the researchers who mapped these ancient crashes wrote a line I cannot get out of my head. He said the Neolithic launched an experiment in the dynamics of food production and demographic growth that is still underway. Still underway. That experiment is the one you and I are living inside right now, 8 billion of us, and we will come back to that thought at the very end. For now, just notice this. The moment we became many, we also became a species that could crash. We had built, for the first time, something big enough to fall. Now, a world filling up with people, with stored grain, with fixed houses and heritable fields, is a world that has invented something else along the way, something no forager band had ever really possessed. It has invented the thing worth taking, and that changes everything. Chapter 15, The First Fence. There is a sentence from the philosopher Rousseau that has echoed for 2.5 centuries, and whether or not it is fair, I want to start here because it names the thing this chapter is about. He imagined the first man who fenced off a piece of ground, said, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him. And Rousseau called that man the true founder of civil society, and blamed him for the crimes and wars and miseries that followed. Now Rousseau was philosophizing, not doing archaeology. There was no single fence and no single man. But he put his finger on something real. Somewhere in the Neolithic, the deepest economic assumption of human life quietly flipped over. For hundreds of thousands of years, we had lived by sharing. And then, without anyone deciding it, we began to live by keeping. This is the chapter where property is born, and with it, its inseparable twin, inequality. Start with what came before, because you cannot feel the size of the change unless you feel the world it replaced. The hunter-gatherer economy ran on a rule so opposite to ours that it is genuinely hard for a modern person to inhabit. You did not accumulate. You could not, everything you owned had to be carried, so an individual's whole material estate might be a digging stick, a bow and a few arrows, some ostrich shell beads, a hide. That was a life's possessions. And when a hunter brought down a big animal, far more meat than one family could eat, it did not become his wealth. It got shared out, immediately, according to iron custom, because there was no way to store it, and because the group survived precisely by not letting any one person hoard. Anthropologists who lived with foraging peoples described something they called demand sharing, a relentless social pressure to give things away the moment you had more than you needed, backed by mockery and shame aimed squarely at anyone who tried to keep too much or act too big. It was a machine, a beautifully effective machine for flattening out difference. In that world, to hoard was not clever. It was shameful. It was a kind of social crime. And I want to be honest and stand up for that world for a second, because it is easy to condescend to it. The anthropologist Marshall Salins gave it a name that has never left me, the original affluent society. His point was mischievous and profound. We assume foragers lived on a knife's edge of starvation, and that farming rescued them into plenty. Salins argued almost the reverse. Affluence, he said, is the ratio between what you want and what you have. And foragers, wanting little and able to get it in a startlingly short working week, were affluent in the only way that matters. He wrote that in these societies, the food quest is so successful that half the time the people do not know what to do with themselves. Now, honesty, always, that thesis got hammered by critics and rightly examined. When you add in all the food processing and the firewood and the water hauling that Salins had quietly left out of his tally, the Kung work week climbs to something like 40-odd hours, right in line with a modern job, and forager life carried its own heavy freight of infant death and hardship. So the affluent society is an overstatement. But the core of it survives the beating, and it is this. These were not desperate people clawing at the edge of survival, gratefully waiting for someone to invent the farm. They had enough. They had leisure. And crucially, they had no wealth to fight over, because their whole social world was engineered to make sure no one ever had much more than anyone else. Hold on to that, because we are about to watch it come apart. What took it apart was, of all unglamorous things, storage. Here is the pivot of the entire chapter, and it turns on the strange properties of a seed of grain. Think about what a granary full of wheat actually is. Unlike a fresh kill which rots in days and must be shared, grain dried will keep. For years, it sits there. It is, in the words of the political scientist James Scott, whose thinking runs all through this chapter, visible, divisible, measurable, storable, transportable. You can count it, you can hoard it, you can pass it to your children, and you can take it from someone by force, and it is still good when you get it home. For the first time in the human story, a person could hold in one place far more concentrated food wealth than they could eat, and it did not spoil, and it did not have to be shared. Grain broke the sharing machine. The very thing that made cereals such superb crops that they ripen all at once and store for years made them the first great object of accumulation, the first true property. And notice what the archaeology shows arriving right alongside the granaries. At Catalhoyuk, that dense honeycomb town we walked through, every house had its own storage rooms, its own bins of wheat and barley and peas and almonds, sealed away, entered only from within the family's own space. Not a communal store. Yours. Behind your walls, under your roof, watched over, this detail gives me a shiver, by little female figurines tucked right inside the grain bins, as if the harvest itself now needed a guardian spirit. The wealth had moved indoors, and what moves indoors becomes private. And once wealth can be stored and inherited, inequality is no longer a moral failing you can shame out of people. It becomes a ratchet, compounding across generations, and the archaeology lets us watch it tighten. At Catalhoyuk again, a careful study found that while the everyday cooking tools were shared out fairly evenly through the town, the heavier capital, the good grinding stones, the storage capacity was distributed unevenly and grew more so over time. The excavators found the community, in their words, becoming less egalitarian, with wealth increasingly passed down bloodlines. The house had become the unit that owned things. The dead were buried right under its floor to stamp the family's claim on the ground itself, and what a house held it handed to its children. That is the quiet birth of the dynasty. Slow, undramatic, house by house, the sharing world dissolving into the keeping world. And then, if you want to see where that ratchet leads once it has run for a few thousand years, you go to a cemetery on the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria called Varna from around 6,500 years ago, and it will stop your breath. Because at Varna, the difference between people has become total. Of the grave excavated, most hold ordinary dead with modest goods, the way you would expect. But a handful of them hold a concentration of wealth that has, frankly, no precedent anywhere on Earth up to that point. There is more gold in this one small cemetery than in all the other archaeological sites of its entire millennium combined. Everywhere, the whole world, Egypt and Mesopotamia included, all of it, outweighed by this one Bulgarian graveyard. Around 3,000 gold objects. And it is concentrated. One grave in particular, we call it grave 43, holds a single man, laid out and dripping in gold. Gold on his arms, a war axe of power beside him, a scepter which is the oldest object we have that simply says one human being ruled over others, and yes, a sheath of gold worn over his penis, because status, in the end, is status. Here is a person whose wealth so wildly exceeds his neighbors that there is no longer any pretending they are the same kind of being. The leveling machine of the foragers is not just broken here, it has been inverted and enshrined. 10,000 years earlier, the man who tried to keep the most meat was shamed. Now the man who kept the most gold is buried like a god. I have to slow down and be careful and honest here, because there is a myth waiting in this material, and it is a seductive one. You will hear it said that Catalhoyuk was a perfect, equal utopia, a peaceful goddess-worshipping commune before greed spoiled everything, and that the fall from grace was sudden. It is more tangled than that. Catalhoyuk was strikingly equal by the standards of what came after. Men and women ate about the same, lived about the same, and a recent genetic study even shows households passing down the female line, mother to daughter, which quietly demolishes the lazy assumption that hierarchy always means patriarchy. So the equality was real, but it was already measurably eroding from within, house by house, generation by generation. There was no fall from Eden, no single villain, no fence built in a day. There was a slow, structural drift, set in motion the moment food became storable, that no one chose and no one could see whole. Which, and I hope you are hearing the drumbeat by now, is the exact same shape as every other transformation in this entire story. Nobody decided to invent inequality, any more than anybody decided to invent farming. The grain decided. the storage bin decided. The brute logic of the thing decided, and the humans followed. And Scott takes this one crucial, chilling step further, and it is where this chapter has been heading all along. That storable, countable, seizable grain did not just make some families richer than others. It made the state itself possible. Because think about what you need in order to have a ruler who lives off other people's labor. You need a food supply you can find, measure, and take. You cannot tax a hunter-gatherer. His wealth is dispersed across a landscape and inside his own skill, and it rots if you seize it. But grain sits in a bin above ground and ripens on a known schedule, and an assessor can walk your field and estimate your harvest before you have even cut it. Scott's argument, stated flat, is that only cereal grains could serve as the basis for taxation, visible, divisible, accessible, and so extractable. The tax collector and the granary are born together, and when we finally reach the earliest writing humans ever made, thousands of years later in Sumer, what does it say? It is not poetry, it is not prayer, it is receipts. Quantities of grain owed and delivered, stamped with the seals of the people they were owed to. The first sentence humanity ever wrote down was, in effect, a record of who owed what to whom. Writing itself was born as a tool for keeping track of surplus and the debts on it. So look at the chain we have built in this one chapter, because it is the skeleton of the world you live in. Grain can be stored. Storage makes surplus. Surplus can be hoarded and inherited, which makes some families rich and others poor. Concentrated, countable surplus can be taxed, which makes rulers and the ruled. And keeping track of it all makes writing and records, and eventually every ledger and title deed and bank balance on earth. Every one of those things, the whole architecture of property and power we swim in, traces back to a simple, world-changing fact about a dried seed that keeps. The fence Rousseau imagined was never a fence. It was a granary. And once it stood, the world of sharing was over, and it has never come back. Now, I have been circling something in this chapter, and in the last one when I spoke of populations crashing and people wanting the same good land. Because a world with surplus worth stealing and stored in fixed houses that cannot run away and filling up with more people than the best soil can feed, that is not just a world of rich men and poor men. It is a world that has invented a new and terrible reason to kill. I promised you at the very beginning honesty, and I told you honesty would include the death pits. It is time to keep that promise. Chapter 16, The Death Pits. I want to begin this chapter by telling you what I am not going to do. I am not going to sell you the story you have probably been told your whole life. The one where deep prehistory was a gentle, peaceful Eden, humanity living in Rousseau's innocent harmony, until wicked civilization came along and taught us how to hate. That story is a comfort, and it is a lie, and I would be breaking my promise to you if I let it stand. I told you at the start of all this that honesty would sometimes cost us our comfort, and that honesty includes the death pits. So take a breath, because we are going to climb down into one. 3 of them, actually. And I will not flinch, and I ask you not to look away, because the people in these pits deserve to be seen. Come first to a spot near Heilbronn in southern Germany, where in 1983 a routine dig opened up a pit in the ground, and out of it came 34 human beings. This is Talheim, and it dates to around 7,000 years ago, to a farming culture we call the linear pottery culture, the LBK, the people who first spread farming across the heart of Europe, whom we will meet properly in a couple of chapters. 34 of them thrown into a pit. 16 were children. And when the forensic anthropologists read these bones, they reconstructed a scene that is almost unbearable in its clarity. Nearly every skull carries the same wound, the print of a farmer's adze, that polished stone tool used to shape wood until earth, here swung as an axe into the back of people's heads. Some struck with the sharp edge, some with the blunt. And here is the detail that tells you everything about how it happened. There are almost no defensive wounds, no smashed forearms, none of the marks you get when a person throws up their hands to ward off a blow. These people were not fighting, they were running. They were cut down from behind as they fled, adults and children together, and dumped without ceremony, without arrangement, without any of the tender under-the-floor burial these same people gave their loved ones, just tipped into a hole. And then the science does something that turns tragedy into a still darker mystery. Researchers measured the strontium in the victim's teeth, that isotope signature, laid down in childhood from the local water and rock, that tells you where a person grew up. And the Talheim dead fell into two distinct groups, locals and people from somewhere else, a different geology. But the truly haunting thing was in the local group, the people who had grown up right there. It contained men. It contained children, and it contained no adult women at all. None. The local women are simply missing from the pit, and the grim, near inescapable inference is that they were not killed. They were taken. This was not only a massacre, it was a raid with a purpose, and the purpose walked away alive, carried off by the attackers, who by the numbers may have outnumbered the villagers 4-1. This was the annihilation of a community and the abduction of its women in a single morning's work. And some of the dead, we can see, had survived earlier violence, old healed wounds on their bones. This was not a bolt from the blue. For these people, the raid was a recurring feature of life. It had simply, this time, succeeded completely. If Talheim were alone, you might call it an aberration, one village's private catastrophe. It is not alone. Go to a Spanschletz in Austria, north of Vienna, same culture, same era. Here the village had a defensive ditch dug around it, which tells you the danger was known and expected, and it did not save them. Archaeologists have pulled up to 200 bodies from that ditch, and estimate the ground still holds 100 more. Sprawled face down, many of them, skulls shattered by blunt stone blows. Skeletons missing arms, missing legs, severed skulls resting apart from their bodies. And the corpses were left where they fell, out in the open ditch, long enough that animals came and gnawed and scattered the bones before anything covered them. Nobody buried these people. There was nobody left to bury them, or nobody who dared. And once again, the same shadow falls across the count, strikingly few young women among the dead. The same pattern. The village destroyed, the young women gone, and a Spanschletz was never lived in again. It was not a battle a village lost and rebuilt from. It was an ending. And then there is the third, and I have to steady myself for this one, because Schöneck Kilienstetten is where you stop being able to tell yourself it was quick. Found during road construction in Germany, another mass grave, at least 26 people, and when Christian Mayer and his colleagues published their study of the bones in 2015, they forced the field to confront something it had been reluctant to name. Because look at what was broken and how. Over half of these people had their lower leg bones smashed, the shins, the tibiae, a rate wildly higher than any other bone in the body. That is not what you get from a frenzied fight or a hail of arrows. Those land more or less anywhere. Shattered shins, specifically and systematically, are what you get when the breaking is deliberate, when it is done to people who are already down, already helpless. The researchers concluded in careful scientific language that somehow makes it worse, that the pattern clearly indicates torture and or mutilation of the victims. They may have been shattering the legs of the dying or the already dead to cripple, to desecrate, to send a message to whoever found them. And at Kilienstetten too, the teenagers and young women are underrepresented, captured, or killed somewhere else. The message was the point. This was violence meant to be read. Now, and here is where I have to be a careful, honest guide and not just a teller of horrors, because the honesty is the whole point. I need you to hold two things at once. The first is that this was real and systematic and cannot be waved away. but the second is that we must not let it stampede us into the opposite myth. Some of these sites are separated by a century or two and by hundreds of miles. There was no single apocalyptic night when the farming world tore itself apart. Even the researchers who documented the horror warned against what they called an exaggerated, apocalyptic framing, and noted that many communities of this culture flowed peacefully into their successors with no sign of massacre at all. So the truth is not the Neolithic was a war of all against all. The truth is narrower, and I think more chilling for being so specific. That lethal, organized, community-annihilating violence was now a real and recurring possibility in human life, concentrated in the later phases of the LBK, when the population had swollen and the good soil had filled up and the weather may have turned against them. Remember those boom and bust crashes from 2 chapters ago, the populations that climbed past what their land could safely hold. This is, in part, what a crash can look like from the ground. Too many people, not enough good land, granaries full of stealable grain, villages rooted to the spot and unable to flee, pack all of that into a landscape, and you have built the machinery of massacre. The foragers, spread thin and always able to walk away from trouble, had a release valve the farmers had welded shut. And I have saved the strangest and most disturbing sight for the end, because it refuses every easy category. It is called Herxheim in Germany, same culture again, and at first the archaeologists thought they had found another massacre. What they had found was stranger. Over about 50 years, the butchered remains of more than 1,000 people were deposited there, people brought, the evidence suggests, from very far away up to hundreds of miles. And butchered is the precise and terrible word. Human skulls split open along a careful, practiced line and worked into cups. Bodies defleshed, dismembered, the long bones cracked and scraped out for their marrow, the flesh apparently cooked. The excavators who studied it most closely concluded, and other scholars still contest this, that Herxheim was a site of ritual cannibalism, not the desperate cannibalism of starvation, but something structured, repeated, ceremonial, done to outsiders over generations. And notice, because the excavators noticed, the skull cups were used and then thrown away, discarded like refuse, not kept and honored as you would keep a beloved ancestor. Whatever these people were to those who ate them, they were not kin. They were the other. Now I have to be scrupulous here. This interpretation is genuinely debated, and some archaeologists read Herxheim instead as an elaborate, if grisly, funerary rite, a way of processing the dead rather than devouring enemies. The jury is honestly still out. But either reading takes us to the same unsettling place. A Neolithic world with a dark, complex, organized relationship to human death and the human body. A world capable of doing this to 1,000 people on purpose, methodically, for half a century. So let me gather this up, because I have made you climb down into some terrible places, and I owe you the meaning of it. The single most important thing these pits do is kill a myth, the myth of the peaceful savage, the noble innocent of prehistory corrupted by civilization. An archaeologist named Lawrence Keeley wrote a whole book demolishing that idea, and he marshaled the evidence to argue that prehistoric peoples, far from being peaceful, could suffer death rates from violence that, measured per head of population, dwarf those of our own war-torn modern age. And a survey of more than 2,000 early farmer skeletons across northwestern Europe found more than 1 in 10 bearing the marks of a weapon. More than 1 in 10. This was not paradise. But then I want to end on the honest knife edge, not on either comfortable myth. The point is not that these people were uniquely brutal, that farmers were somehow worse humans than foragers. The point is about what farming built. It built the surplus worth raiding. It built the fixed, unfleeable village. It built the crowding and the land hunger. It handed people, for the first time, a set of standing reasons to annihilate their neighbors and take what they had stored, and, in the missing women of Talheim and Aspan, a reason to take the neighbors themselves. Violence was not invented in the Neolithic. A lone traveler frozen in an alpine glacier around this time, the man we call Ötzi, died with an arrowhead in his shoulder and the blood of 4 other people on his gear, so the killing was old. What the Neolithic invented was violence at scale, violence with an economic logic, the massacre of the settled by the settled over the stored fruits of the earth. We made the world worth fighting for. And so, with a terrible inevitability, we began to fight for it. I promised you the death pits. There they are. Let us climb back up into the light, but do not forget them. Chapter 17. 7 times over. I have to make a confession now, and it is a confession about the shape of this whole story so far. For 16 chapters, I have been telling you about one place. One corner of the world, that arc of hills and rivers running from the Levant up through Anatolia and down into Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, and one bundle of crops and creatures, wheat, barley, the sheep, the goat, the aurochs. I have let it stand, a little, as if that were the story of farming. And in one sense it is the first chapter of it, the earliest we know. But if I stopped there, I would be leaving you with a profound misunderstanding, and it happens to be the most important idea in this entire episode, the one that finally locks the whole thing shut. Because the truth is this: it happened again, and again, and again. Not once, not spreading outward from a single genius valley to the rest of a passive world, but independently from scratch, by people who had never heard of the Fertile Crescent and never would, in at least 7 separate places, and by some counts as many as 11. Farming was not invented. Farming was discovered over and over by our species wherever the conditions were ripe, like water finding the same level in 7 separate glasses. And I want you to feel the weight of that because it changes what the Neolithic means. If it had happened only once, you could call it an accident, a fluke of one clever people. But it happened 7 times over. And a thing that happens 7 times, on different continents, with different plants, among people who never met, that is not an accident. That is something closer to a law. Let me take you around the world, because each of these is its own miracle, and I have favorites. Start in China, where there were not 1 but 2 independent farming worlds inside a single landmass. In the north, along the Yellow River, people domesticated millet, foxtail and broomcorn millet, tough little golden grains, around 8,000 years ago. And far to the south, in the warm wetlands of the Yangtze, entirely separate people were doing something staggeringly difficult. They were domesticating rice, taming a wild marsh grass into the plant that today feeds more human beings than any other single food on Earth. And here is a detail I love. For a long time, scholars argued bitterly about whether rice was domesticated once or several times, and the genetics came in and settled it with beautiful precision. All of Asia's rice, every grain of it, traces back to a single domestication event in China, the exact same non-shattering mutation. Remember our stubborn stalk that would not let go. The identical genetic switch, flipped once, carried everywhere. The rice on a plate in Tokyo and the rice in a bowl in Chennai are cousins descended from one ancient Chinese field. 2 farming revolutions in one country, and then, thousands of years ago, the millet world of the north and the rice world of the south met in the middle, and China's agriculture was born from their marriage. Now come with me across the Pacific to what is, for my money, the single most astonishing act of domestication anywhere in the human record. Mesoamerica. Maize. Corn. You know what an ear of corn looks like: fat, heavy, hundreds of plump kernels in tidy rows. A plant so productive it feeds half the planet's livestock and turns up in everything you eat. Now I want you to look at its wild ancestor, a scraggly Mexican grass called teosinte, and I promise you will not believe they are related. Teosinte carries not a fat cob but a pathetic little spike, maybe a dozen hard seeds in a single row, each one locked inside a shell so tough you could break a tooth on it, and the whole thing shatters and scatters the moment it ripens. It looks nothing like corn. It looks like a weed. For decades, scientists refused to believe corn could have come from it. It seemed impossible. But it did. Somehow, people in the Balsas River Valley of southern Mexico, around 9,000 years ago, took that miserable grass and, over centuries of patient selection, unlocked it, turned the dozen stony seeds into hundreds of soft ones, turned the spike into the cob, turned a weed into the engine of whole civilizations. Geneticists now think the gulf between teosinte and maize is controlled by surprisingly few genes, but that does not make the achievement smaller. It makes it more mysterious, because it means some very early people found and pushed exactly the right levers, blind, with no theory of genetics, just eyes and hunger and time. And the Maya never forgot where they came from. In their great creation epic, the Popol Vuh, the gods try to make human beings out of mud and they dissolve. They try wood and the people come out soulless. And only on the third attempt, when the gods grind yellow and white maize into dough and shape humans from it, do they make beings who can truly speak and see and give thanks. The Maya said, in so many words, we are made of corn. And after what their ancestors did to teosinte, who could argue? I can't take you everywhere, but I have to at least name the others, because their variety is the whole point. In the high Andes of South America, people domesticated the potato, hundreds of varieties of it, along with quinoa and tomatoes and peppers, and the only large animal the Americas ever tamed for hauling, the llama. And on that agriculture, on the desert coast of Peru, rose Cairo, a city of monumental pyramids that is as old as the pyramids of Egypt. A whole civilization most people have never heard of, built without pottery, without the wheel, without a single domesticated cow or horse. In the highlands of New Guinea, in a place called Cuck Swamp, people were draining wetlands and cultivating taro and bananas and sugarcane at least 7,000 years ago, maybe far earlier. A genuine, independent invention of agriculture in a place the textbooks used to ignore completely. There's a lovely piece of vindication there. A geographer named Carl Sauer insisted, back in the 1950s, that Southeast Asia would prove to be an early cradle of a different kind of farming, one based on roots and cuttings rather than seeds, and he was laughed at for it. And then, decades later, the mud of Cuck Swamp proved him right. In Africa, not one cradle but 3 sorghum and pearl millet in the Sahel, an entire suite of crops in the Ethiopian highlands including the ancestor of your morning coffee, and in the inland delta of the Niger, a completely separate species of rice, domesticated by African people from an African wild grass, with no connection whatsoever to the rice of China. Africans invented rice farming twice removed from Asia, on their own terms. And then my quiet favorite, because it is the one that got erased. Eastern North America, right in the middle of the continent, in the river valleys of what is now Illinois and Missouri and Tennessee, indigenous people independently domesticated their own crops, a little sunflower grown for its seeds, a plant called sumpweed, a squash, and a humble weed you have walked past 1,000 times called goosefoot or lamb's quarters. They bred it, selected it, thinned its husk down to 1/3 of the wild thickness, the unmistakable fingerprint of deliberate domestication. For centuries these were staple foods, a genuine Eastern agricultural revolution. And then maize arrived from Mexico, and a hardier northern strain of it eventually proved so productive that the old native crops were abandoned, one by one, and left to go wild again. And here is the detail that stops my heart. Once people stopped selecting them, those domesticated seeds reverted within a few generations back to their small wild size. The domestication simply unwound. It is one of the only places on Earth where you can watch farming rise, thrive, and then quietly vanish, leaving almost nothing but a scatter of seeds in the ground for an archaeologist to puzzle over 4,000 years later. A lost agricultural civilization in the American heartland that most Americans have never heard a word about. So, 7 times over. And I want to draw the thread tight because this is the payoff of the whole journey through these chapters. Look at what these people did not share. They shared no crops, wheat here, rice there, maize, potato, taro, sorghum, goosefoot. They shared no animals. They shared no contact, no trade, no messenger, no common language, no idea passed hand to hand. Whole oceans and whole eras separated them. And yet they all, independently, walked through the same door at roughly the same act of the human story, the door out of the long walking life, and into the settled, planting, storing, multiplying, unequal, disease-ridden, world-conquering life of the farm. And that near universality is the final nail in the coffin of the idea that anybody chose this. You cannot have 7 separate committees making the same catastrophic decision by coincidence. What you can have is 7 separate peoples, each responding to the same deep pressures: a warming, stabilizing climate after the Ice Age, rising populations, a dwindling of the great game, the seductive local abundance of some tameable grass, each stumbling, blindly and without a plan, down the exact same path, because the path was there in the structure of the world, waiting to be fallen into. The stubborn stalk in the Fertile Crescent had a twin in the Yangtze and a cousin in Mexico and a shadow in a swamp in New Guinea. This was not humanity having an idea. This was humanity meeting its destiny over and over and never once seeing it whole. Nobody chose this, not once, not 7 times. And that, I think, is one of the most profound and unsettling things we know about ourselves. Now we've watched farming ignite independently across the whole world. But there is one more part of the story I owe you, and it is the part that made the world you actually live in, how the farmers of that first Fertile Crescent came, at last, to Europe. And thanks to a revolution in science that has happened almost entirely within my own lifetime, we can now watch it happen, gene by gene, in a way our grandparents could only have dreamed of. It is a story of a wave and of a vanishing. Chapter 18: The Wave and the Vanishing. I want to tell you about a woman who died 7,000 years ago near what is now Stuttgart in Germany, because she settled an argument that had raged for 100 years, and she did it from inside her own bones. But to feel why she matters, you have to understand the argument. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists fought a great, stubborn war over a deceptively simple question. When farming spread from the Near East into Europe, what actually moved? Did people move, real human beings, families, walking and sailing west with their seed grain and their sheep, physically settling the continent and pushing the old inhabitants aside? Or did only the idea move, the knowledge of farming passed from group to group, neighbor teaching neighbor, so that Europe's own native hunter-gatherers gradually learned to farm and became the farmers? No great migration required. Pots or people. It sounds academic. It is actually one of the deepest questions you can ask about who Europeans are. And for a century, honestly, we could not answer it, because pottery and stone tools can travel either way, in a migrant's bag or in a good idea. We were stuck. And then, in just the last decade or so, a genuinely revolutionary technology broke the whole thing open. The ability to pull ancient DNA out of very old bones and read it. This is one of the most thrilling developments in the entire study of the human past, and I don't want to rush past the wonder of it. We can now take the petrous bone, the dense knot of bone around the inner ear, from a skeleton thousands of years old, and recover enough genetic code to say where that person's ancestors came from. We can, in effect, interview the dead about their family tree. And when researchers did this to that woman near Stuttgart, one of the first farmers of Central Europe, the answer came back stunning and clear. She was not descended from Europe's hunter-gatherers, not remotely. Genetically, her closest living relatives are not Northern Europeans at all. They are the people of Sardinia, that Mediterranean island where a pocket of early farmer ancestry survived relatively undiluted. She was, in her deep ancestry, an Anatolian farmer, the descendant of migrants who had walked their lineage step by step out of Turkey and across the Balkans and up the Danube. The farming did not spread as an idea taught to the locals. It spread as a people moving. The bones settled it. It was migration, overwhelmingly, not teaching. Real families, carrying real seed, came and settled Europe. They came by two great routes, and I love the neatness of it. One wave went overland, up the Danube and its tributaries into the heart of Central Europe. These are the linear pottery people, the LBK, whom you already know, because we met them in the death pits. They spread with astonishing speed, covering the lowest plains from Hungary to the Paris basin in just a few centuries, building enormous timber longhouses, some of them 150 feet long, and everywhere they went their pottery carries the same incised, ribbon-like lines that give them their name. The other wave went by sea, hugging the Mediterranean coast in boats, island-hopping westward, the cardial people, who decorated their pots by pressing the serrated edge of a cockle shell into the wet clay. And the radiocarbon dates for these coastal sites do something eerie. From Italy all the way to Portugal, thousands of miles of coastline, they cluster within a century or two of each other, as though a fleet of small pioneer colonies leapfrogged the whole northern Mediterranean in a few human lifetimes. Boats full of farmers, with grain and goats aboard, planting new colonies down the coast of a continent. And the genetics confirms the beautiful symmetry. Both waves, the Danube overlanders and the Mediterranean sailors, came from the same ancestral farming population back in the Balkans. Two arms of one embrace, closing around Europe. So what happened to the people already there? The hunter-gatherers of Europe, who had lived on that continent for tens of thousands of years, through the Ice Age itself, the painters of the great caves. This is where it gets both fascinating and a little haunting, and I have to be careful and honest, because the picture is not simple, and the honesty is the whole point. In many places, they largely vanished from the genetic record. In Britain, when farming arrived around 6,000 years ago, the ancient DNA shows something close to a wholesale replacement. The indigenous Western hunter-gatherers, including the famous dark-skinned, blue-eyed individual we call Cheddar Man, are almost entirely genetically overwritten by the incoming farmers. They simply stop appearing in the ancestry. And here is the honesty. It was not the same everywhere, and it was not always a clean, sudden erasure. Elsewhere, the two peoples lived side by side for 1,000 years or more and slowly mixed. Down in Iberia and along the Atlantic, hunter-gatherer ancestry lingers much higher, absorbed gradually into the farming population rather than snuffed out. In Scandinavia, remarkably, a hunter-gatherer culture called the pitted, where people lived on for centuries, genetically pure foragers, right next door to farmers, keeping their old life going by choice while agriculture flowered beside them. So the truth is a spectrum, from near total replacement in the north to long, gradual blending in the south. But the headline, the thing that would have astonished every archaeologist of a century ago, holds. Europe was not converted to farming. Europe was, in large part, resettled by farmers, and its ancient foragers were, in large part, absorbed or erased. The world you think of as native European is, underneath, an Anatolian farming world that flowed in and took root. And these incoming farmers left monuments, the great stones, the megaliths that still stand across the western edge of the continent and that I have loved since I was a child. More than 35,000 of them raised across Atlantic Europe, the standing stones, the stone rows of Karnak marching in their thousands across the Breton fields, the huge chambered tombs. Let me take you inside just one, because it is a piece of genius. Newgrange in Ireland, built around 5,200 years ago, older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid. It is a vast mound with a single narrow passage of stone running deep into its heart. And its builders aligned that passage with such precision that on just a handful of mornings around the winter solstice, and only then, the rising sun sends a blade of light through a specially cut opening above the door, down the whole length of the passage, to creep across the floor of the central chamber and illuminate it for about 17 minutes before the light withdraws and the chamber returns to darkness for another year. Farmers built that. People with stone tools and no writing calculated the turning of the year and built a machine of earth and rock to catch the exact moment the light begins to come back. And ancient DNA has given Newgrange one last, strange twist. The man buried in its most elaborate inner recess was, the genetics reveal, the product of first-degree incest, a brother-sister or parent-child union. That is a pattern known from only a handful of societies in all of history, and always the same kind. God-kings, ruling dynasties, so exalted they married within themselves to keep the bloodline pure, like the pharaohs and the Inca. Which suggests that by this point, in this monumental farming society, inequality had climbed all the way to the top, to a sacred elite who buried one of their own like a living god inside a mountain of stone aligned to the sun. Remember the gold of Varna. This is the same ratchet, still turning, 1,000 years on and a continent away. But I promised you a vanishing, and the deepest vanishing is the one that closes this chapter. Because these farming societies of Europe, having spread and thrived and raised their great stones, did something that we are only now, with our population reconstructions, able to see clearly. Many of them collapsed. Around 5,500 years ago, across much of northwestern Europe, the signs of farming falter, the cereal pollen thins out of the lake beds, settlements empty, the population curves plunge. This is the boom and bust we traced earlier, now playing out on a continental scale, and for a long time nobody knew why. And then, once again, ancient DNA delivered a suspect. In a 5,000-year-old tomb in Sweden, packed with dozens of bodies buried in quick succession, researchers found, lurking in the dental pulp of the dead, the DNA of a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, plague. The plague, the same organism that thousands of years later would become the Black Death. It was here in Neolithic Europe at the very time the farming world was crashing. And it is tempting, so tempting, to close the case right there. The first plague swept through the crowded, animal-ridden, trade-connected farming villages that had made themselves the perfect kindling for exactly such a fire and burned the Neolithic down. But honesty always, and this is a live debate right now, unfolding in the journals as we speak. Other researchers have pushed back hard. They point out that this ancient plague strain seems to have lacked a crucial gene that lets modern plague ride in the gut of a flea and leap explosively from host to host, which makes it hard to see how it could have caused a true pandemic. Only a couple of individuals out of many tested actually carried it. The crash may have been plague, or soil exhaustion, or climate, or war, or the whole grim orchestra playing at once. The jury is genuinely still out, and I would be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. But here is what is not in doubt, and what I want you to carry out of this chapter. The farming revolution, even in its great European triumph, was never a smooth ascent. It came as a wave that resettled a continent and erased much of what was there before. It raised sublime monuments to the returning sun, and then in places it fell, crashed, emptied, and had to begin again. Growth outrunning its foundation and paying for it, the same shape one last time. We built something big enough to fall, and it fell, and we rebuilt it, and here we still are. And here we still are. That is exactly where I want to end this journey. Because we have traveled 11,000 years and 7 continents to arrive, finally, at the one place this story was always heading. Your own life, right now, today. Let me bring you home. Chapter 19. The Experiment's Still Running. Here we are then, at the end of the road we set out on together all those hours ago. And I want to begin the ending where we began the beginning, with a single seed in the palm of a hand. Do you remember? I asked you to hold it, that one small dry grass seed on a warm plain 11,000 years ago, and I made you a promise. I promised that by the time we reached the end, I would bring you back to your own kitchen, your own body, your own restless planning mind, and show you that seed in all of it. This is me keeping that promise. So let me do it properly, one thing at a time, because you have earned the payoff and I have been saving it. Start with the simplest thing in the world, a loaf of bread. The next time you hold one, feel its weight, tear it, smell it. I want you to know exactly what you are holding. You are holding the stubborn stalk that would not let go of its seed, the one accident of nature I asked you to remember in the very first chapter, bred across 10,000 years into the staff of human life. You are holding the reason the first farmers' teeth rotted in their heads, because those same soft, sweet starches that feed you fed the bacteria that invented the cavity. You are holding the weaning food, the pot of gruel that shortened the birth intervals and set off the greatest population explosion before the modern age. The bread, quite literally, that filled the world with us. A loaf of bread is not a simple thing. It is the single most consequential object our species ever made, and you can buy it for pocket change and you eat it without a thought. I don't think you will ever quite hold one thoughtlessly again. That was the promise. There it is. Now a field of wheat. When you next pass one, gold, rippling, ordinary, I want you to see what is actually standing there. Every one of those identical stalks holds its seed tight instead of scattering it, which means every one of them is a plant that literally cannot reproduce without us. It has no wild future. We bred the wildness out of it, and in exchange it feeds billions, and neither the wheat nor we can walk away from the bargain now. We think we domesticated it. But look at that field, and ask yourself honestly who tends whom. We clear the land for it, we water it, we guard it from every rival, we have reshaped whole continents to give it room, we have spent 10,000 years in its service. And a thinker named Michael Pollan put it perfectly. It is just as true to say the grasses domesticated us. They tricked a clever ape into spreading them to every corner of the earth and defending them with his life. That field of wheat is not our servant. It is our partner and our master, and we are just as much its instrument as it is ours. Nobody chose that. The stalk that would not let go reached out of that first field and took hold of the whole human future, and it has not let go of us since. And now the hardest one, the one I promised at the very start and have been building toward all along, your own restless, planning, future-haunted mind. Because this, I think, is the deepest and least visible thing the seed did to us. Listen to how a man named James Sussman, who spent years living with the Jew/Honsi foragers of the Kalahari, describes the difference. The hunter-gatherers he knew, he says, worked to meet their immediate needs and then stopped. They did not hold themselves hostage to the future, did not defer and hoard and sacrifice today for a tomorrow that might never come. But farming, Sussman argues, built something new inside the human soul, an economy of hope and anxiety. in which we fix our eyes almost helplessly on the future, plant now to reap later, save, invest, worry, defer our happiness endlessly down the road. Think about what a farmer must do that a forager need not. He must look at good grain and not eat it, because it is next year's seed. He must labor in the spring for a harvest half a year away. He must store, and having stored, he must worry about the weather, about theft, about the winter, about the neighbor. And Sussman's point, which I find genuinely staggering, is that this anxious, deferring, accumulating, future-haunted way of being that every one of us takes for utterly natural, that feels like simply what it is to be a person, is not human nature at all. It is a 10,000-year-old habit of mind, planted with the first seed. When you lie awake at night worried about your career, your savings, your children's future, your retirement, the slow accumulation of a life, you are not malfunctioning. You are running the software the Neolithic installed. That restless planning mind is the seed grown up inside your own skull. I promised you I would bring you back to it. Here you are. Do you feel it? And it is not only in your mind. It is in your body and your world everywhere once you learn to see it. Those 3 grains on the plate, do you remember at the very start, I said the whole story runs on grass. Right now, today, 3 domesticated grasses, wheat, rice, and corn, provide the majority of all the calories consumed by all 8 billion of us. 3 plants, first tamed by a handful of anonymous people in 3 separate valleys thousands of years ago, still feed the entire species, and every one of them, the scientists will tell you, is deficient in something your body needs, just as the first farmers were. We are still, all of us, eating the narrow diet of the Neolithic and still paying a version of its nutritional price. And remember the cattle, I told you hours ago, to hold on to a single fact and that we would come back to it at the very end. Here we are at the very end. The total weight of the cattle we have bred now outweighs every wild mammal left alive on the planet, combined. That relationship that began with 1 bold Aurochs and 1 hungry village has physically remade the living surface of the earth in the image of our appetite. And there is one more thing to say about those cattle, and it is the darkest and most elegant thread of all. A researcher named Timothy Kohler found that inequality grew deepest across the ancient world, precisely where people had large domesticated animals to pull plows and pile up wealth. And he points out that our very word, capital, the beating heart word of the entire modern economy, comes down to us from the same ancient root as the word cattle. Cattle became capital. The herd in the field became the fortune in the bank. The gold in grave 43 at Varna, the god-king walled inside Newgrange, the gap between the billionaire and the pauper today. It is all one unbroken line, and it starts in the Neolithic barnyard. And the plagues, I have to name them here at the end, because we are living inside this one right now. Every reader of this, every one of us, just lived through a pandemic. And the coronavirus that shut down the world was, like most of our great emerging diseases, a zoonosis, a sickness that leapt to us from animals, across exactly the kind of crowded human-animal interface that agriculture invented, and that we have since scaled up beyond the wildest nightmares of any Neolithic village. Measles from cattle, influenza from pigs and birds, the plague from the rodents in the granary, and now a novel coronavirus in a globalized world of 8 billion. It is all the same story, the same machine we first switched on when we packed ourselves into permanent settlements beside our herds. The thread runs unbroken from the Neolithic barnyard to the 21st century intensive care unit. We are still getting sick in the exact way farming taught us to get sick. The experiment is still running. So, we come, at the very last, to the question I planted in the first chapter and asked you to hold in tension the whole way through. Was it the worst mistake in the history of the human race? I promised I would not tidy that away, and I won't. And here is where I have honestly landed after all these hours, and you are free to disagree, because the smartest people who study this still do. I don't think mistake is the right word, and you know by now exactly why. A mistake needs a chooser, and there was never a chooser, not in the Fertile Crescent, not in the Yangtze, not in Mexico, not 7 times over across a world of strangers. Nobody weighed the options and picked wrong. We were led, blind and hungry, down a path built into the structure of the world, by a stubborn stork and a bold wolf, and the pitiless arithmetic of a woman who could wean her baby onto gruel and so have another. But was it a catastrophe for the individual human body and the individual human peace? On that, I think the bones have already testified, and their verdict is hard to argue with. The farmer was shorter, sicker, more anxious, more unequal, and more likely to be slaughtered over a granary than the forager who came before. Marshal Salins called those foragers the original affluent society, and though he overstated it, the core survives every attack. They wanted little, they got it in a short working week, and one of them, asked why on earth his people didn't take up farming, gave the answer I have never been able to forget: why should we when there are so many mongongo nuts in the world? There is a whole lost way of being human in that one line. We traded it away, not for a better life, for more lives. Quality for quantity, and quantity is what inherited the earth. But here is the thought I want to leave you with, because I don't think the story is a tragedy, and I don't think it's a triumph, and I think the honest shape of it is stranger and better than either. That same bargain that cost the individual so much also bought the species everything else. Every city, every book, every symphony and vaccine and telescope, this very voice reaching your ears across whatever distance separates us, the entire cathedral of human achievement, all of it standing on the surplus that the seed made possible. You cannot have the one without the other. The disease and the despotism came in the same bundle as the poetry and the medicine, tied together with the same string, and that string is a stalk of wheat. And the deepest truth of all is the one from the researchers who mapped those ancient population crashes and wrote a single line I cannot shake. The Neolithic, they said, launched an experiment in food and growth and human life that is still underway. Still underway. It did not end 11,000 years ago. It did not end when the first city rose or the last Aurochs died. It is running right now, through you, at 8 billion strong, still eating the three grasses, still outweighed by our own cattle, still lying awake with the farmer's anxious mind, still one crowded barnyard away from the next plague, still deciding, and now, for the first time, perhaps actually able to decide, what kind of creatures the seed will make of us next. You are not a spectator to the Neolithic revolution. You are the latest chapter of it. It is not behind you. It is you. And if that leaves you feeling like the great story is finished, like all the deciding and discovering happened long ago, and there is nothing left to find, let me leave you, as I love to, with the opposite, and it is true, because we have barely begun to read this world. Out on that arc of Turkish hills where our whole story started, near Göbekli Tepe, the archaeologists have realized in just the last few years that it was never alone. There is a whole scattered constellation of sister sites, a dozen of them. They call it Tash Tepala, the Stone Hills, and one of them, Karahan Tepe, is only barely scratched. Most of it is still in the ground. Right now, as you listen to me, there are carved pillars and buried enclosures and answers to questions we don't even know how to ask yet, lying in the earth where hunter-gatherers left them 11,000 years ago, waiting. We do not know what they will say. Somebody is going to be the first human being in all those millennia to brush the soil off the next one and look at what it shows and understand something no one has ever understood. It might be someone very young right now. It might, I like to think, be someone listening to this. The seed is still in the ground. The story is still being written. and you and I have only just learned how to read it. Thank you for traveling into the deep past with me. This has been the story of the Neolithic revolution, the bargain that made us. The next time you eat a piece of bread, you'll know.